Chapter 8. A year had passed since the two Swedes had been driven in terror from the savage country where the sheik held sway. Little Miriam still played with Geeka, lavishing all her childish love upon the now almost hopeless ruin of what had never, even in its palmiest days, possessed even a slight degree of loveliness. But to Miriam, Geeka was all that was sweet and adorable. She carried to the deaf ears of the battered ivory head all her sorrows, all her hopes, and all her ambitions, for even in the face of hopelessness, in the clutches of the dread authority from which there was no escape, little Miriam yet cherished hopes and ambitions. It is true that her ambitions were rather nebulous in form, consisting chiefly of a desire to escape with Geeka to some remote and unknown spot where there were no sheiks, no mabunas, where Eladria could find no entrance, and where she might play all day surrounded only by flowers and birds and the harmless little monkeys playing in the treetops. The sheik had been away for a long time, conducting a caravan of ivory skins and rubber far into the north. The interim had been one of great peace for Miriam. It is true that Mabunu had still been with her, to pinch or beat her as the mood seized the villainous old hag, but Mabunu was only one. When the sheik was there also, there were two of them, and the sheik was stronger and more brutal even than Mabunu. Little Miriam often wondered why the grim old man hated her so. It is true that he was cruel and unjust to all with whom he came in contact, but to Miriam he reserved his greatest cruelties, his most studied injustices. Today Miriam was squatting at the foot of a large tree which grew inside the palisade close to the edge of the village. She was fashioning a tent of leaves for Geeka. Before the tent were some pieces of wood and small leaves and a few stones. These were the household utensils. Geeka was cooking dinner. As the little girl played, she prattled continuously to her companion, propped in a sitting position with a couple of twigs. She was totally absorbed in the domestic duties of Geeka, so much so that she did not note the gentle swaying of the branches of the tree above her as they bent to the body of the creature that had entered them stealthily from the jungle. In happy ignorance the little girl played on, while from above two steady eyes looked down upon her, unblinking, unwavering. There was none other than the little girl in this part of the village, which had been almost deserted since the sheik had left long months before upon his journey toward the north. And out in the jungle, an hour's march from the village, the sheik was leading his returning caravan homeward. A year had passed since the white men had fired upon the lad and driven him back into the jungle to take up his search for the only remaining creatures to whom he might look for companionship, the great apes. For months the two had wandered eastward, deeper and deeper into the jungle. The year had done much for the boy, turning his already mighty muscles to thews of steel, developing his woodcraft to a point where it verged upon the uncanny, perfecting his arboreal instincts, and training him in the use of both natural and artificial weapons. He had become at last a creature of marvelous physical powers and mental cunning. He was still but a boy, yet so great was his strength that the powerful anthropoid with which he often engaged in mimic battle was no match for him. Akut had taught him to fight as the bull-ape fights, nor ever was there a teacher better fitted to instruct in the savage warfare of primordial man, or a pupil better equipped to profit by the lessons of a master. As the two searched for a band of the almost extinct species of ape to which Akut belonged, they lived upon the best the jungle afforded. Antelope and zebra fell to the boy's spear, or were dragged down by the two powerful beasts of prey who leapt upon them from some overhanging limb, or from the ambush of the undergrowth beside the trail to the waterhole or the ford. The pelt of a leopard covered the nakedness of the youth, but the wearing of it had not been dictated by any prompting of modesty. With the rifle shots of the white men showering about him, he had reverted to the savagery of the beast that is inherent in each of us, but that flamed more strongly in this boy, whose father had been raised a beast of prey. He wore his leopard skin at first in response to a desire to parade a trophy of his prowess, for he had slain the leopard with his knife in a hand-to-hand combat. He saw that the skin was beautiful, which appealed to his barbaric sense of ornamentation, and when it stiffened and later commenced to decompose because of his having no knowledge of how to cure or tan it, was with sorrow and regret that he discarded it. Later, when he chanced upon a lone, black warrior wearing the counterpart of it, soft and clinging and beautiful from proper curing, it required but an instant to leap from above upon the shoulders of the unsuspecting black, sink a keen blade into his heart, and possess the rightly preserved hide. There were no after-qualms of conscience. In the jungle might is right, nor does it take long to inculcate this axiom in the mind of a jungle dweller, regardless of what his past training may have been. That the black would have killed him had he had the chance, the boy knew full well. Neither he nor the black were any more sacred than the lion, or the buffalo, the zebra, or the deer, or any other of the countless creatures who roamed, or slunk, or flew, or wriggled through the dark mazes of the forest. Each had but a single life which was sought by many. The greater number of enemies slain, the better chance to prolong that life. So the boy smiled and donned the finery of the vanquished, and went his way with Akut, searching, always searching for the elusive anthropoids who were to welcome them with open arms. And at last they found them. Deep in the jungle, buried far from sight of man, they came upon such another little natural arena as had witnessed the wild ceremony of the dum-dum, in which the boy's father had taken part long years before. First, at a great distance, they heard the beating of the drum of the great apes. They were sleeping in the safety of a huge tree when the booming sound smote upon their ears. Both awoke at once. Akut was the first to interpret the strange cadence. "The great apes," he growled. "They dance the dum-dum. Come, Korak, son of Tarzan, let us go to our people." Months before, Akut had given the boy a name of his own choosing, since he could not master the man-given name of Jack. Korak is as near as it may be interpreted into human speech. In the language of the apes it means killer. Now the killer rose upon the branch of the great tree where he had been sleeping with his back braced against the stem. He stretched his lithe young muscles, the moonlight filtering through the foliage from above, dappling his brown skin with little patches of light. The ape, too, stood up, half squatting after the manner of his kind. Low growls rumbled from the bottom of his deep chest, growls of excited anticipation. The boy growled in harmony with the ape. Then the anthropoid slid softly to the ground. Close by, in the direction of the booming drum, lay a clearing which they must cross. The moon flooded it with silvery light. Half erect, the great ape shuffled into the full glare of the moon. At his side, swinging gracefully along in marked contrast to the awkwardness of his companion, strode the boy, the dark, shaggy coat of the one brushing against the smooth, clear hide of the other. The lad was humming now a music hall air that had found its way to the forms of the great English public school that was to see him no more. He was happy and expectant. The moment he had looked forward to for so long was about to be realized. He was coming into his own, he was coming home. As the months had dragged or flown along, retarded or spurred on as privation or adventure predominated, thoughts of his own home, while oft recurring, had become less vivid. The old life had grown to seem more like a dream than a reality, and the bulking of his determination to reach the coast and return to London had finally thrown the hope of realization so remotely into the future that it too now seemed little more than a pleasant but hopeless dream. Now all thoughts of London and civilization were crowded so far into the background of his brain that they might as well have been non-existent. Except for form and mental development, he was as much an ape as the great, fierce creature at his side. In the exuberance of his joy, he slapped his companion roughly on the side of the head. Half in anger, half in play, the anthropoid turned upon him, his fangs bared and glistening. Long, hairy arms reached out to seize him, and as they had done 1,000 times before, the two clinched in mimic battle, rolling upon the sward, striking, growling and biting, though never closing their teeth in more than a rough pinch. It was wondrous practice for them both. The boy brought into play wrestling tricks that he had learned at school, and many of these Akut learned to use and to foil. And from the ape, the boy learned the methods that had been handed down to Akut from some common ancestor of them both, who had roamed the teeming earth when ferns were trees and crocodiles were birds. But there was one art the boy possessed which Akut could not master, though he did achieve fair proficiency in it for an ape boxing. To have his bull-like charges stopped and crumpled with a suddenly planted fist upon the end of his snout, or a painful jolt in the short ribs, always surprised Akut. It angered him too, and at such times his mighty jaws came nearer to closing in the soft flesh of his friend than at any other, for he was still an ape, with an ape's short temper and brutal instincts, but the difficulty was in catching his tormentor while his rage lasted. For when he lost his head and rushed madly into close quarters with the boy, he discovered that the stinging hail of blows released upon him always found their mark and effectually stopped him effectually and painfully. Then he would withdraw, growling viciously, backing away with grinning jaws distended to sulk for an hour or so. Tonight they did not box. Just for a moment or two they wrestled playfully, until the scent of Sheeta, the panther, brought them to their feet. Alert and wary, the great cat was passing through the jungle in front of them. For a moment it paused, listening. The boy and the ape growled menacingly in chorus, and the carnivore moved on. Then the two took up their journey toward the sound of the dum-dum. Louder and louder came the beating of the drum. Now, at last, they could hear the growling of the dancing apes, and strong to their nostrils came the scent of their kind. The lad trembled with excitement. The hair down Akut's spine stiffened. The symptoms of happiness and anger are often similar. Silently, they crept through the jungle as they neared the meeting place of the apes. Now they were in the trees, worming their way forward, alert for sentinels. Presently, through a break in the foliage, the scene burst upon the eager eyes of the boy. To Akut it was a familiar one, but to Korak it was all new. His nerves tingled at the savage sight. The great bulls were dancing in the moonlight, leaping in an irregular circle about the flat-topped earthen drum, about which 3 old females sat beating its resounding top with sticks worn smooth by long years of use. Akut, knowing the temper and customs of his kind, was too wise to make their presence known until the frenzy of the dance had passed. After the drum was quiet and the bellies of the tribe well filled, he would hail them. Then would come a parley, after which he and Korak would be accepted into membership by the community. There might be those who would object, but such could be overcome by brute force, of which he and the lad had an ample surplus. For weeks, possibly months, their presence might cause ever-decreasing suspicion among others of the tribe, but eventually they would become as born brothers to these strange apes. He hoped that they had been among those who had known Tarzan, for that would help in the introduction of the lad and in the consummation of Akut's dearest wish, that Korak should become king of the apes. It was with difficulty, however, that Akut kept the boy from rushing into the midst of the dancing anthropoids, an act that would have meant the instant extermination of them both. Since the hysterical frenzy into which the great apes work themselves during the performance of their strange rites is of such a nature that even the most ferocious of the carnivora give them a wide berth at such times. As the moon declined slowly toward the lofty, foliaged horizon of the amphitheatre, the booming of the drum decreased and lessened were the exertions of the dancers, until at last the final note was struck, and the huge beasts turned to fall upon the feast they had dragged hither for the orgy. From what he had seen and heard, Akut was able to explain to Korak that the rites proclaimed the choosing of a new king, and he pointed out to the boy the massive figure of the shaggy monarch, come into his kingship, no doubt. As many human rulers have come into theirs by the murder of his predecessor. When the apes had filled their bellies and many of them had sought the bases of the trees to curl up and sleep, Akut plucked Korak by the arm. "Come," he whispered. "Come slowly. Follow me. Do as Akut does." Then he advanced slowly through the trees until he stood upon a bough overhanging one side of the amphitheatre. Here he stood in silence for a moment. Then he uttered a low growl. Instantly a score of apes leaped to their feet. Their savage little eyes sped quickly around the periphery of the clearing. The king ape was the first to see the 2 figures upon the branch. He gave voice to an ominous growl. Then he took a few lumbering steps in the direction of the intruders. His hair was bristling. His legs were stiff, imparting a halting, jerky motion to his gait. Behind him pressed a number of bulls. He stopped just a little before he came beneath the 2, just far enough to be beyond their spring. "Wary king." Here he stood rocking himself to and fro upon his short legs, baring his fangs in hideous grinnings, rumbling out an ever-increasing volume of growls, which were slowly but steadily increasing to the proportions of roars. Akut knew that he was planning an attack upon them. The old ape did not wish to fight. He had come with the boy to cast his lot with the tribe. "I am Akut," he said. "This is Korak. Korak is the son of Tarzan, who was king of the apes. I too was king of the apes who dwelt in the midst of the great waters. We have come to hunt with you, to fight with you. We are great hunters. We are mighty fighters. Let us come in peace." The king ceased his rocking. He eyed the pair from beneath his beetling brows. His bloodshot eyes were savage and crafty. His kingship was very new and he was jealous of it. He feared the encroachments of 2 strange apes. The sleek, brown, hairless body of the lad spelled man, and man he feared and hated. "Go away," he growled. "Go away, or I will kill you." The eager lad, standing behind the great Akut, had been pulsing with anticipation and happiness. He wanted to leap down among these hairy monsters and show them that he was their friend, that he was one of them. He had expected that they would receive him with open arms, and now the words of the king ape filled him with indignation and sorrow. The blacks had set upon him and driven him away. Then he had turned to the white men, to those of his own kind, only to hear the ping of bullets, where he had expected words of cordial welcome. The great apes had remained his final hope. To them he looked for the companionship man had denied him. Suddenly rage overwhelmed him. The king ape was almost directly beneath him. The others were formed in a half-circle several yards behind the king. They were watching events interestedly. Before Akut could guess his intention or prevent, the boy leaped to the ground directly in the path of the king, who had now succeeded in stimulating himself to a frenzy of fury. "I am Korak," shouted the boy. "I am the killer. I came to live among you as a friend. You want to drive me away? Very well, then I shall go, but before I go I shall show you that the son of Tarzan is your master, as his father was before him, that he is not afraid of your king or you." For an instant the king ape had stood motionless with surprise. He had expected no such rash action upon the part of either of the intruders. Akut was equally surprised. Now he shouted excitedly for Korak to come back, for he knew that in the sacred arena the other bulls might be expected to come to the assistance of their king against an outsider, though there was small likelihood that the king would need assistance. Once those mighty jaws closed upon the boy's soft neck, the end would come quickly. To leap to his rescue would mean death for Akut too, but the brave old ape never hesitated. Bristling and growling, he dropped to the sward just as the king ape charged. The beast's hands clutched for their hold as the animal sprang upon the lad. The fierce jaws were wide distended to bury the yellow fangs deeply in the brown hide. Korak, too, leapt forward to meet the attack, but leaped crouching beneath the outstretched arms. At the instant of contact the lad pivoted on one foot, and with all the weight of his body and the strength of his trained muscles drove a clenched fist into the bull's stomach. With a gasping shriek the king ape collapsed, clutching futilely for the agile, naked creature nimbly sidestepping from his grasp. Howls of rage and dismay broke from the bull apes behind the fallen king. As with murder in their savage little hearts they rushed forward upon Korak and Akut, but the old ape was too wise to court any such unequal encounter. To have counseled the boy to retreat now would have been futile, and Akut knew it. To delay even a second in argument would have sealed the death warrants of them both. There was but a single hope, and Akut seized it. Grasping the lad around the waist, he lifted him bodily from the ground, and turning ran swiftly toward another tree which swung low branches above the arena. Close upon their heels swarmed the hideous mob, but Akut, old though he was and burdened by the weight of the struggling Korak, was still fleeter than his pursuers. With a bound he grasped a low limb, and with the agility of a little monkey swung himself and the boy to temporary safety. Nor did he hesitate even here, but raced on through the jungle night, bearing his burden to safety. For a time the bulls pursued, but presently, as the swifter outdistanced the slower and found themselves separated from their fellows, they abandoned the chase, standing roaring and screaming until the jungle reverberated to their hideous noises. Then they turned and retraced their way to the amphitheater. When Akut felt assured that they were no longer pursued, he stopped and released Korak. The boy was furious. "Why did you drag me away?" he cried. I would have taught them all. Now they will think that I am afraid of them." "What they think cannot harm you," said Akut. "You are alive. If I had not brought you away, you would be dead now, and so would I. Do you not know that even Numa slinks from the path of the great apes when there are many of them and they are mad?" Chapter 9. It was an unhappy Korak who wandered aimlessly through the jungle the day following his inhospitable reception by the great apes. His heart was heavy from disappointment. Unsatisfied vengeance smoldered in his breast. He looked with hatred upon the denizens of his jungle world, baring his fighting fangs and growling at those that came within radius of his senses. The mark of his father's early life was strong upon him and enhanced by months of association with beasts, from whom the imitative faculty of youth had absorbed a countless number of little mannerisms of the predatory creatures of the wild. He bared his fangs now as naturally and upon as slight provocation as Sheeta, the panther, bared his. He growled as ferociously as Akut himself. When he came suddenly upon another beast, his quick crouch bore a strange resemblance to the arching of a cat's back. Korak, the killer, was looking for trouble. In his heart of hearts he hoped to meet the king ape who had driven him from the amphitheater. To this end he insisted upon remaining in the vicinity, but the exigencies of the perpetual search for food led them several miles further away during day. They were moving slowly downwind, and warily, because the advantage was with whatever beast might chance to be hunting ahead of them, where their scent spoor was being borne by the light breeze. Suddenly the two halted simultaneously. Two heads were cocked upon one side. Like creatures hewn from solid rock, they stood immovable, listening. Not a muscle quivered. For several seconds they remained thus. Then Korak advanced cautiously a few yards and leapt nimbly into a tree. Akut followed close upon his heels. Neither had made a noise that would have been appreciable to human ears at a dozen paces. Stopping often to listen, they crept forward through the trees. That both were greatly puzzled was apparent from the questioning looks they cast at one another from time to time. Finally, the lad caught a glimpse of a palisade 100 yards ahead, and beyond it the tops of some goatskin tents and a number of thatched huts. His lip upcurled in a savage snarl. Blacks, how he hated them. He signed to Akut to remain where he was while he advanced to reconnoiter. Woe betide the unfortunate villager whom the killer came upon now, slinking through the lower branches of the trees, leaping lightly from one jungle giant to its neighbor where the distance was not too great, or swinging from one handhold to another. Korak came silently toward the village. He heard a voice beyond the palisade, and toward that he made his way. A great tree overhung the enclosure at the very point from which the voice came. Into this Korak crept. His spear was ready in his hand. His ears told him of the proximity of a human being. All that his eyes required was a single glance to show him his target. Then, lightning-like, the missile would fly to its goal. With raised spear he crept among the branches of the tree, glaring narrowly downward in search of the owner of the voice which rose to him from below. At last he saw a human back. The spear hand flew to the limit of the throwing position to gather the force that would send the iron-shod missile completely through the body of the unconscious victim. And then the killer paused. He leaned forward a little to get a better view of the target. Was it to ensure more perfect aim, or had there been that in the graceful lines and the childish curves of the little body below him that had held in check the spirit of murder running riot in his veins? He lowered his spear cautiously that it might make no noise by scraping against foliage or branches. Quietly he crouched in a comfortable position along a great limb, and there he lay with wide eyes looking down in wonder upon the creature he had crept upon to kill, looking down upon a little girl, a little nut-brown maiden. The snarl had gone from his lip. His only expression was one of interested attention. He was trying to discover what the girl was doing. Suddenly a broad grin overspread his face, for a turn of the girl's body had revealed Gika of the ivory head and the rat-skin torso, Gika of the splinter limbs and the disreputable appearance. The little girl raised the marred face to hers and, rocking herself backward and forward, crooned a plaintive Arab lullaby to the doll. A softer light entered the eyes of the killer. For a long hour that passed very quickly to him, Korak lay with gaze riveted upon the playing child. Not once had he had a view of the girl's full face. For the most part he saw only a mass of wavy, black hair, one brown little shoulder exposed upon the side from where her single robe was caught beneath her arm, and a shapely knee protruding from beneath her garment as she sat cross-legged upon the ground. A tilt of the head as she emphasized some maternal admonition to the passive Gika revealed occasionally a rounded cheek or a piquant little chin. Now she was shaking a slim finger at Gika reprovingly, and again she crushed to her heart this only object upon which she might lavish the untold wealth of her childish affections. Korak, momentarily forgetful of his bloody mission, permitted the fingers of his spear hand to relax a little their grasp upon the shaft of his formidable weapon. It slipped, almost falling, but the occurrence recalled the killer to himself. It reminded him of his purpose in slinking stealthily upon the owner of the voice that had attracted his vengeful attention. He glanced at the spear with its well-worn grip and cruel, barbed head. Then he let his eyes wander again to the dainty form below him. In imagination he saw the heavy weapon shooting downward. He saw it pierce the tender flesh, driving its way deep into the yielding body. He saw the ridiculous doll drop from its owner's arms to lie sprawled and pathetic beside the quivering body of the little girl. The killer shuddered, scowling at the inanimate iron and wood of the spear, as though they constituted a sentient being endowed with a malignant mind. Korak wondered what the girl would do were he to drop suddenly from the tree to her side. Most likely she would scream and run away. Then would come the men of the village with spears and guns and set upon him. They would either kill him or drive him away. A lump rose in the boy's throat. He craved the companionship of his own kind, though he scarce realized how greatly. He would have liked to slip down beside the little girl and talk with her, though he knew from the words he had overheard that she spoke a language with which he was unfamiliar. They could have talked by signs a little. That would have been better than nothing. Too, he would have been glad to see her face. What he had glimpsed assured him that she was pretty, but her strongest appeal to him lay in the affectionate nature revealed by her gentle mothering of the grotesque doll. At last he hit upon a plan. He would attract her attention and reassure her by a smiling greeting from a greater distance. Silently, he wormed his way back into the tree. It was his intention to hail her from beyond the palisade, giving her the feeling of security which he imagined the stout barricade would afford. He had scarcely left his position in the tree when his attention was attracted by a considerable noise upon the opposite side of the village. By moving a little, he could see the gate at the far end of the main street. A number of men, women, and children were running toward it. It swung open, revealing the head of a caravan upon the opposite side. In trooped the motley organization, black slaves and dark-hued Arabs of the northern deserts, cursing camel drivers urging on their vicious charges overburdened donkeys, waving sadly pendulous ears while they endured with stoic patience the brutalities of their masters' goats, sheep, and horses. Into the village they all trooped behind a tall, sour old man, who rode without greetings to those who shrunk from his path directly to a large goatskin tent in the center of the village. Here he spoke to a wrinkled hag. Korak, from his vantage spot, could see it all. He saw the old man asking questions of the black woman, and then he saw the latter point toward a secluded corner of the village which was hidden from the main street by the tents of the Arabs and the huts of the natives in the direction of the tree beneath which the little girl played. This was doubtless her father, thought Korak. He had been away, and his first thought upon returning was of his little daughter. How glad she would be to see him, how she would run and throw herself into his arms, to be crushed to his breast and covered with his kisses. Korak sighed. He thought of his own father and mother far away in London. He returned to his place in the tree above the girl. If he couldn't have happiness of this sort himself, he wanted to enjoy the happiness of others. Possibly if he made himself known to the old man, he might be permitted to come to the village occasionally as a friend. It would be worth trying. He would wait until the old Arab had greeted his daughter, then he would make his presence known with signs of peace. The Arab was striding softly toward the girl. In a moment he would be beside her, and then how surprised and delighted she would be. Korak's eyes sparkled in anticipation, and now the old man stood behind the little girl. His stern old face was still unrelaxed. The child was yet unconscious of his presence. She prattled on to the unresponsive Gika. Then the old man coughed. With a start the child glanced quickly up over her shoulder. Korak could see her full face now. It was very beautiful in its sweet and innocent childishness, all soft and lovely curves. He could see her great dark eyes. He looked for the happy love light that would follow recognition, but it did not come. Instead, terror, stark, paralyzing terror, was mirrored in her eyes, in the expression of her mouth, in the tense, cowering attitude of her body. A grim smile curved the thin, cruel lip of the Arab. The child essayed to crawl away, but before she could get out of his reach, the old man kicked her brutally, sending her sprawling upon the grass. Then he followed her up to seize and strike her as was his custom. Above them, in the tree, a beast crouched where a moment before had been a boy, a beast with dilating nostrils and bared fangs, a beast that trembled with rage. The sheik was stooping to reach for the girl when the killer dropped to the ground at his side. His spear was still in his left hand, but he had forgotten it. Instead, his right fist was clenched, and as the sheik took a backward step, astonished by the sudden materialization of this strange apparition apparently out of clear air, the heavy fist landed full upon his mouth, backed by the weight of the young giant and the terrific power of his more than human muscles. Bleeding and senseless, the sheik sank to earth. Korak turned toward the child. She had regained her feet and stood wide-eyed and frightened, looking first into his face and then, horror-struck, at the recumbent figure of the sheik. In an involuntary gesture of protection, the killer threw an arm about the girl's shoulders and stood waiting for the Arab to regain consciousness. For a moment they remained thus, when the girl spoke. "When he regains his senses, he will kill me," she said, in Arabic. Korak could not understand her. He shook his head, speaking to her first in English and then in the language of the great apes, but neither of these was intelligible to her. She leaned forward and touched the hilt of the long knife that the Arab wore. Then she raised her clasped hand above her head and drove an imaginary blade into her breast above her heart. Korak understood. The old man would kill her. The girl came to his side again and stood there trembling. She did not fear him. Why should she? He had saved her from a terrible beating at the hands of the sheik. Never in her memory had another so befriended her. She looked up into his face. It was a boyish, handsome face, nut brown like her own. She admired the spotted leopard skin that circled his lithe body from one shoulder to his knees. The metal anklets and armlets adorning him aroused her envy. Always had she coveted something of the kind, but never had the sheik permitted her more than the single cotton garment that barely sufficed to cover her nakedness. No furs or silks or jewelry had there ever been for little Miriam. And Korak looked at the girl. He had always held girls in a species of contempt. Boys who associated with them were, in his estimation, mollycoddles. He wondered what he should do. Could he leave her here to be abused, possibly murdered by the villainous old Arab? No, but on the other hand, could he take her into the jungle with him? What could he accomplish burdened by a weak and frightened girl? She would scream at her own shadow when the moon came out upon the jungle night, and the great beasts roamed, moaning and roaring through the darkness. He stood for several minutes buried in thought. The girl watched his face, wondering what was passing in his mind. She, too, was thinking of the future. She feared to remain and suffer the vengeance of the sheikh. There was no one in all the world to whom she might turn, other than this half-naked stranger who had dropped miraculously from the clouds to save her from one of the sheikh's accustomed beatings. Would her new friend leave her now? Wistfully she gazed at his intent face. She moved a little closer to him, laying a slim, brown hand upon his arm. The contact awakened the lad from his absorption. He looked down at her, and then his arm went about her shoulder once more, for he saw tears upon her lashes. "Come," he said. "The jungle is kinder than man. You shall live in the jungle, and Korak and Akut will protect you." She did not understand his words, but the pressure of his arm drawing her away from the prostrate Arab and the tents was quite intelligible. One little arm crept about his waist, and together they walked toward the palisade. Beneath the great tree that had harbored Korak, while he watched the girl at play, he lifted her in his arms and, throwing her lightly across his shoulder, leaped nimbly into the lower branches. Her arms were about his neck, and from one little hand Gika dangled down his straight young back. And so Miriam entered the jungle with Korak, trusting in her childish innocence the stranger who had befriended her, and perhaps influenced in her belief in him by that strange intuitive power possessed by woman. She had no conception of what the future might hold. She did not know, nor could she have guessed the manner of life led by her protector. Possibly she pictured a distant village similar to that of the sheik, in which lived other white men like the stranger. That she was to be taken into the savage, primeval life of a jungle beast could not have occurred to her. Had it, her little heart would have palpitated with fear. Often had she wished to run away from the cruelties of the sheikh and Mabunu, but the dangers of the jungle always had deterred her. The two had gone but a short distance from the village when the girl spied the huge proportions of the great Akut. With a half-stifled scream she clung more closely to Korak and pointed fearfully toward the ape. Akut, thinking that the killer was returning with a prisoner, came growling toward them. A little girl aroused no more sympathy in the beast's heart than would a full-grown bull ape. She was a stranger and therefore to be killed. He bared his yellow fangs as he approached, and to his surprise the killer bared his likewise, but he bared them at Akut and snarled menacingly. "Ah," thought Akut, "the killer has taken a mate," and so, obedient to the tribal laws of his kind, he left them alone, becoming suddenly absorbed in a fuzzy caterpillar of peculiarly succulent appearance. The larva disposed of, he glanced from the corner of an eye at Korak. The youth had deposited his burden upon a large limb, where she clung desperately to keep from falling. "She will accompany us," said Korak to Akut, jerking a thumb in the direction of the girl. "Do not harm her. We will protect her." Akut shrugged. To be burdened by the young of man was in no way to his liking. He could see from her evident fright at her position on the branch, and from the terrified glances she cast in his direction, that she was hopelessly unfit. By all the ethics of Akut's training and inheritance, the unfit should be eliminated, but if the killer wished this, there was nothing to be done about it but to tolerate her. Akut certainly didn't want her, of that he was quite positive. Her skin was too smooth and hairless, quite snake-like in fact, and her face was most unattractive. Not at all like that of a certain lovely she he had particularly noticed among the apes in the amphitheater the previous night. Ah, there was true feminine beauty for one. A great, generous mouth, lovely yellow fangs, and the cutest, softest side whiskers. Akut sighed. Then he rose, expanded his great chest, and strutted back and forth along a substantial branch. For even a puny thing like this, she of Korak's might admire his fine coat and his graceful carriage. But poor little Miriam only shrank closer to Korak and almost wished that she were back in the village of the sheik, where the terrors of existence were of human origin, and so more or less familiar. The hideous ape frightened her. He was so large and so ferocious in appearance. His actions she could only interpret as a menace, for how could she guess that he was parading to excite admiration? Nor could she know of the bond of fellowship which existed between this great brute and the godlike youth who had rescued her from the sheikh. Miriam spent an evening and a night of unmitigated terror. Korak and Akut led her along dizzy ways as they searched for food. Once they hid her in the branches of a tree while they stalked a nearby buck. Even her natural terror of being left alone in the awful jungle was submerged in a greater horror as she saw the man and the beast spring simultaneously upon their prey and drag it down, as she saw the handsome face of her preserver contorted in a bestial snarl as she saw his strong, white teeth buried in the soft flesh of the kill. When he came back to her, blood smeared his face and hands and breast, and she shrank from him as he offered her a huge hunk of hot, raw meat. He was evidently much disturbed by her refusal to eat, and when, a moment later, he scampered away into the forest to return with fruit for her, she was once more forced to alter her estimation of him. This time she did not shrink, but acknowledged his gift with a smile that, had she known it, was more than ample payment to the affection-starved boy. The sleeping problem vexed Korak. He knew that the girl could not balance herself in safety in a tree crotch while she slept, nor would it be safe to permit her to sleep upon the ground open to the attacks of prowling beasts of prey. There was but a single solution that presented itself: he must hold her in his arms all night, and that he did with Akut braced upon one side of her and he upon the other, so that she was warmed by the bodies of them both. She did not sleep much until the night was half spent, but at last nature overcame her terrors of the black abyss beneath and the hairy body of the wild beast at her side, and she fell into a deep slumber which outlasted the darkness. When she opened her eyes, the sun was well up. At first she could not believe in the reality of her position. Her head had rolled from Korak's shoulder so that her eyes were directed upon the hairy back of the ape. At sight of it she shrank away. Then she realized that someone was holding her, and turning her head she saw the smiling eyes of the youth regarding her. When he smiled she could not fear him, and now she shrank closer against him in natural revulsion toward the rough coat of the brute upon her other side. Korak spoke to her in the language of the apes, but she shook her head, and spoke to him in the language of the Arab, which was as unintelligible to him as was ape speech to her. Akut sat up and looked at them. He could understand what Korak said, but the girl made only foolish noises that were entirely unintelligible and ridiculous. Akut could not understand what Korak saw in her to attract him. He looked at her long and steadily, appraising her carefully. Then he scratched his head, rose and shook himself. His movement gave the girl a little start. She had forgotten Akut for the moment. Again she shrank from him. The beast saw that she feared him, and being a brute enjoyed the evidence of the terror his brutishness inspired. Crouching, he extended his huge hand stealthily toward her, as though to seize her. She shrank still further away. Akut's eyes were busy drinking in the humor of the situation. He did not see the narrowing eyes of the boy upon him, nor the shortening neck as the broad shoulders rose in a characteristic attitude of preparation for attack. As the ape's fingers were about to close upon the girl's arm, the youth rose suddenly with a short, vicious growl. A clenched fist flew before Miriam's eyes to land full upon the snout of the astonished Akut. With an explosive bellow, the anthropoid reeled backward and tumbled from the tree. Korak stood glaring down upon him when a sudden swish in the bushes close by attracted his attention. The girl too was looking down, but she saw nothing but the angry ape scrambling to his feet. Then, like a bolt from a crossbow, a mass of spotted yellow fur shot into view straight for Akut's back. It was Sheeta the leopard. Chapter 10. As the leopard leapt for the great ape, Miriam gasped in surprise and horror, not for the impending fate of the anthropoid, but at the act of the youth who but an instant before had angrily struck his strange companion. For scarce had the carnivore burst into view than with drawn knife the youth had leaped far out above him, so that as Sheeta was almost in the act of sinking fangs and talons in Akut's broad back, the killer landed full upon the leopard's shoulders. The cat halted in mid-air, missed the ape by but a hair's breadth, and with horrid snarlings rolled over upon its back, clutching and clawing in an effort to reach and dislodge the antagonist, biting at its neck and knifing it in the side. Akut, startled by the sudden rush from his rear, and following hoary instinct, was in the tree beside the girl with an agility little short of marvelous in so heavy a beast. But the moment that he turned to see what was going on below him brought him as quickly to the ground again. Personal differences were quickly forgotten in the danger which menaced his human companion, nor was he a whit less eager to jeopardize his own safety in the service of his friend than Korak had been to succor him. The result was that Sheeta presently found two ferocious creatures tearing him to ribbons. Shrieking, snarling and growling, the three rolled hither and thither among the underbrush, while with staring eyes the sole spectator of the battle royal crouched trembling in the tree above them, hugging Gika frantically to her breast. It was the boy's knife which eventually decided the battle, and as the fierce feline shuddered convulsively and rolled over upon its side, the youth and the ape rose and faced one another across the prostrate carcass. Korak jerked his head in the direction of the little girl in the tree. "Leave her alone," he said, "she is mine." Akut grunted, blinked his bloodshot eyes, and turned toward the body of Sheeta. Standing erect upon it, he threw out his great chest, raised his face toward the heavens, and gave voice to so horrid a scream that once again the little girl shuddered and shrank. It was the victory cry of the bull ape that has made a kill. The boy only looked on for a moment in silence, then he leaped into the tree again, to the girl's side. Akut presently rejoined them. For a few minutes he busied himself licking his wounds, then he wandered off to hunt his breakfast. For many months the strange life of the three went on unmarked by any unusual occurrences. At least without any occurrences that seemed unusual to the youth or the ape, but to the little girl it was a constant nightmare of horrors for days and weeks, until she too became accustomed to gazing into the eyeless sockets of death and to the feel of the icy wind of his shroud-like mantle. Slowly she learned the rudiments of the only common medium of thought exchange which her companions possessed, the language of the great apes. More quickly she perfected herself in jungle craft, so that the time soon came when she was an important factor in the chase, watching while the others slept, or helping them to trace the spoor of whatever prey they might be stalking. Akut accepted her on a footing which bordered upon equality when it was necessary for them to come into close contact, but for the most part he avoided her. The youth always was kind to her, and if there were many occasions upon which he felt the burden of her presence, he hid it from her. Finding that the night damp and chill caused her discomfort and even suffering, Korak constructed a tight little shelter high among the swaying branches of a giant tree. Here little Miriam slept in comparative warmth and safety, while the killer and the ape perched upon nearby branches, the former always before the entrance to the lofty domicile, where he best could guard its inmate from the dangers of arboreal enemies. They were too high to feel much fear of Sheeta, but there was always Hista, the snake, to strike terror to one's soul, and the great baboons who lived nearby and who, while never attacking, always bared their fangs and barked at any of the trio when they passed near them. After the construction of the shelter, the activities of the three became localized. They ranged less widely, for there was always the necessity of returning to their own tree at nightfall. A river flowed nearby. Game and fruit were plentiful, as were fish also. Existence had settled down to the daily humdrum of the wild, the search for food and the sleeping upon full bellies. They looked no further ahead than today. If the youth thought of his past and of those who longed for him in the distant metropolis, it was in a detached and impersonal sort of way, as though that other life belonged to another creature than himself. He had given up hope of returning to civilization, for since his various rebuffs at the hands of those to whom he had looked for friendship, he had wandered so far inland as to realize that he was completely lost in the mazes of the jungle. Then, too, since the coming of Miriam, he had found in her that one thing which he had most missed before in his savage jungle life: human companionship. In his friendship for her there was appreciable no trace of sex influence of which he was cognizant. They were friends, companions, that was all. Both might have been boys, except for the half-tender and always masterful manifestation of the protective instinct which was apparent in Korak's attitude. The little girl idolized him as she might have idolized an indulgent brother had she had one. Love was a thing unknown to either, but as the youth neared manhood it was inevitable that it should come to him as it did to every other savage jungle male. As Miriam became proficient in their common language, the pleasures of their companionship grew correspondingly. For now they could converse, and aided by the mental powers of their human heritage, they amplified the restricted vocabulary of the apes until talking was transformed from a task into an enjoyable pastime. When Korak hunted, Miriam usually accompanied him, for she had learned the fine art of silence when silence was desirable. She could pass through the branches of the great trees now with all the agility and stealth of the killer himself. Great heights no longer appalled her. She swung from limb to limb, or she raced through the mighty branches, sure-footed, lithe, and fearless. Korak was very proud of her, and even old Akut grunted in approval where before he had growled in contempt. A distant village of blacks had furnished her with a mantle of fur and feathers with copper ornaments and weapons, for Korak would not permit her to go unarmed or unversed in the use of the weapons he stole for her. A leather thong over one shoulder supported the ever-present Gika, who was still the recipient of her most sacred confidences. A light spear and a long knife were her weapons of offense or defense. Her body, rounding into the fullness of an early maturity, followed the lines of a Greek goddess, but there the similarity ceased, for her face was beautiful. As she grew more accustomed to the jungle and the ways of its wild denizens, fear left her. As time wore on, she even hunted alone when Korak and Akut were prowling at a great distance, as they were sometimes forced to do when game was scarce in their immediate vicinity. Upon these occasions she usually confined her endeavors to the smaller animals, though sometimes she brought down a deer and once even Horta, the boar, a great tusker that even Sheeta might have thought twice before attacking. In their stamping grounds in the jungle, the three were familiar figures. The little monkeys knew them well, often coming close to chatter and frolic about them. When Akut was by, the small folk kept their distance, but with Korak they were less shy, and when both the males were gone they would come close to Miriam, tugging at her ornaments or playing with Dika, who was a never-ending source of amusement to them. The girl played with them and fed them, and when she was alone they helped her to pass the long hours until Korak's return. Nor were they worthless as friends. In the hunt they helped her locate her quarry. Often they would come racing through the trees to her side to announce the near presence of antelope or giraffe, or with excited warnings of the proximity of Sheeta or Numa. Luscious, sun-kissed fruits which hung far out upon the frail bough of the jungle's waving crest were brought to her by these tiny, nimble allies. Sometimes they played tricks upon her, but she was always kind and gentle with them, and in their wild, half-human way they were kind to her and affectionate. Their language being similar to that of the great apes, Miriam could converse with them, though the poverty of their vocabulary rendered these exchanges anything but feasts of reason. For familiar objects they had names, as well as for those conditions which induced pain or pleasure, joy, sorrow, or rage. These root words were so similar to those in use among the great anthropoids as to suggest that the language of the Manus was the mother tongue. And at best it lent itself to but material and sordid exchange. Dreams, aspirations, hopes, the past, the future held no place in the conversation of Manu the monkey. All was of the present, particularly of filling his belly and catching lice. Poor food was this to nourish the mental appetite of a girl just upon the brink of womanhood, and so finding Manu only amusing as an occasional playfellow or pet, Miriam poured out her sweetest soul thoughts into the deaf ears of Gika's ivory head. To Gika she spoke in Arabic, knowing that Gika, being but a doll, could not understand the language of Korak and Akut, and that the language of Korak and Akut, being that of male apes, contained nothing of interest to an Arab doll. Gika had undergone a transformation since her little mother had left the village of the sheik. Her garmenture now reflected in miniature that of Miriam. A tiny bit of leopard skin covered her rat-skin torso from shoulder to splinter knee. A band of braided grasses about her brow held in place a few gaudy feathers from the parakeet, while other bits of grass were fashioned into imitations of arm and leg ornaments of metal. Gika was a perfect little savage, but at heart she was unchanged, being the same omnivorous listener as of yore. An excellent trait in Gika was that she never interrupted in order to talk about herself. Today was no exception. She had been listening attentively to Miriam for an hour, propped against the bole of a tree, while her lithe young mistress stretched cat-like and luxurious along a swaying branch before her. "Little Gika," said Miriam, "our Korak has been gone for a long time today. We miss him, little Gika, do we not? It is dull and lonesome in the great jungle when our Korak is away. What will he bring us this time, eh? Another shining band of metal for Miriam's ankle, or a soft duskin loincloth from the body of a black she? He tells me that it is harder to get the possessions of the shes, for he will not kill them as he does the males, and they fight savagely when he leaps upon them to wrest their ornaments from them. Then come the males with spears and arrows, and Korak takes to the trees. Sometimes he takes the she with him, and high among the branches dives her of the things he wishes to bring home to Miriam. He says that the blacks fear him now, and at first sight of him the women and children run shrieking to their huts, but he follows them within, and it is not often that he returns without arrows for himself and a present for Miriam. Korak is mighty among the jungle people, our Korak, Gika no my Korak. Miriam's conversation was interrupted by the sudden plunge of an excited little monkey that landed upon her shoulders in a flying leap from a neighboring tree. "Climb," he cried. "Climb. The Mangani are coming." Miriam glanced lazily over her shoulder at the excited disturber of her peace. "Climb yourself, little Manu," she said. "The only Mangani in our jungle are Korak and Akut. It is they you have seen returning from the hunt. Some day you will see your own shadow, little Manu, and then you will be frightened to death." But the monkey only screamed his warning more lustily before he raced upward toward the safety of the high terrace where Mangani the great ape could not follow. Presently Miriam heard the sound of approaching bodies swinging through the trees. She listened attentively. There were two, and they were great apes Korak and Akut. To her, Korak was an ape, a Mangani, for as such the three always described themselves. Man was an enemy, so they did not think of themselves as belonging any longer to the same genus. Tarmangani, or great white ape, which described the white man in their language, did not fit them all. Gomangani, great black ape, or Negro, described none of them, so they called themselves plain Mangani. Miriam decided that she would feign slumber and play a joke on Korak. So she lay very still with eyes tightly closed. She heard the two approaching closer and closer and closer. They were in the adjoining tree now and must have discovered her, for they had halted. Why were they so quiet? Why did not Korak call out his customary greeting? The quietness was ominous. It was followed presently by a very stealthy sound. One of them was creeping upon her. Was Korak planning a joke upon his own account? Well, she would fool him. Cautiously she opened her eyes the tiniest bit, and as she did so her heart stood still. Creeping silently toward her was a huge bull ape that she never before had seen. Behind him was another like him. With the agility of a squirrel, Miriam was upon her feet, and at the same instant the great bull lunged for her. Leaping from limb to limb to limb, the girl fled through the jungle, while close behind her came the two great apes. Above them raced a bevy of screaming, chattering monkeys, hurling taunts and insults at the Mangani, and encouragement and advice to the girl. From tree to tree swung Miriam, working ever upward toward the smaller branches which would not bear the weight of her pursuers. Faster and faster came the bull apes after her. The clutching fingers of the foremost were almost upon her again and again, but she eluded them by sudden bursts of speed or reckless chances as she threw herself across dizzy spaces. Slowly she was gaining her way to the greater heights where safety lay when, after a particularly daring leap, the swaying branch she grasped bent low beneath her weight, nor whipped upward again as it should have done. Even before the rending sound which followed, Miriam knew that she had misjudged the strength of the limb. It gave slowly at first. Then there was a ripping as it parted from the trunk. Releasing her hold, Miriam dropped among the foliage beneath, clutching for a new support. She found it a dozen feet below the broken limb. She had fallen thus many times before, so that she had no particular terror of a fall. It was the delay which appalled her most, and rightly, for scarce had she scrambled to a place of safety than the body of the huge ape dropped at her side, and a great, hairy arm went about her waist. Almost at once the other ape reached his companion's side. He made a lunge at Miriam, but her captor swung her to one side, bared his fighting fangs, and growled ominously. Miriam struggled to escape. She struck at the hairy breast and bearded cheek. She fastened her strong, white teeth in one shaggy forearm. The ape cuffed her viciously across the face. Then he had to turn his attention to his fellow, who quite evidently desired the prize for his own. The captor could not fight to advantage upon the swaying bow, burdened as he was by a squirming, struggling captive, so he dropped quickly to the ground beneath. The other followed him, and here they fought, occasionally abandoning their duel to pursue and recapture the girl, who took every advantage of her captor's preoccupation in battle to break away and attempted escape, but always they overtook her. And first one and then the other possessed her as they struggled to tear one another to pieces for the prize. Often the girl came in for many blows that were intended for a hairy foe, and once she was felled, lying unconscious, while the apes, relieved of the distraction of detaining her by force, tore into one another in fierce and terrible combat. Above them screamed the little monkeys, racing hither and thither in a frenzy of hysterical excitement. Back and forth over the battlefield flew countless birds of gorgeous plumage, squawking their hoarse cries of rage and defiance. In the distance a lion roared. The larger bull was slowly tearing his antagonist to pieces. They rolled upon the ground, biting and striking. Again, erect upon their hind legs, they pulled and tugged like human wrestlers, but always the giant fangs found their bloody part to play until both combatants and the ground about them were red with gore. Miriam, through it all, lay still and unconscious upon the ground. At last one found a permanent hold upon the jugular of the other, and thus they went down for the last time. For several minutes they lay with scarce a struggle. It was the larger bull who arose alone from the last embrace. He shook himself. A deep growl rumbled from his hairy throat. He waddled back and forth between the body of the girl and that of his vanquished foe. Then he stood upon the latter and gave tongue to his hideous challenge. The little monkeys broke, screaming, in all directions as the terrifying noise broke upon their ears. The gorgeous birds took wing and fled. Once again the lion roared, this time at a greater distance. The great ape waddled once more to the girl's side. He turned her over upon her back, and stooping commenced to sniff and listen about her face and breast. She lived. The monkeys were returning. They came in swarms and from above hurled down insults upon the victor. The ape showed his displeasure by baring his teeth and growling up at them. Then he stooped and lifting the girl to his shoulder waddled off through the jungle. In his wake followed the angry mob. Chapter 11. Korak, returning from the hunt, heard the jabbering of the excited monkeys. He knew that something was seriously amiss. Hista, the snake, had doubtless coiled his slimy folds about some careless Manu. The youth hastened ahead. The monkeys were Miriam's friends. He would help them if he could. He traveled rapidly along the middle terrace. In the tree by Miriam's shelter, he deposited his trophies of the hunt and called aloud to her. There was no answer. He dropped quickly to a lower level. She might be hiding from him. Upon a great branch where Miriam often swung at indolent ease, he saw Gika propped against the tree's great bole. What could it mean? Miriam had never left Gika thus alone before. Korak picked up the doll and tucked it in his belt. He called again, more loudly, but no Miriam answered his summons. In the distance, the jabbering of the excited Manus was growing less distinct. Could their excitement be in any way connected with Miriam's disappearance? The bare thought was enough. Without waiting for Akut, who was coming slowly along some distance in his rear, Korak swung rapidly in the direction of the chattering mob. But a few minutes sufficed to overtake the rearmost. At sight of him they fell to screaming and pointing downward ahead of them, and a moment later Korak came within sight of the cause of their rage. The youth's heart stood still in terror as he saw the limp body of the girl across the hairy shoulders of a great ape. That she was dead he did not doubt, and in that instant there arose within him a something which he did not try to interpret, nor could have had he tried, but all at once the whole world seemed centered in that tender, graceful body, that frail little body, hanging so pitifully limp and helpless across the bulging shoulders of the brute. He knew then that little Miriam was his world, his sun, his moon, his stars with her going had gone all light and warmth and happiness. A groan escaped his lips, and after that a series of hideous roars, more bestial than the beasts, as he dropped plummet-like in mad descent toward the perpetrator of this hideous crime. The bull ape turned at the first note of this new and menacing voice, and as he turned a new flame was added to the rage and hatred of the killer. For he saw that the creature before him was none other than the king ape which had driven him away from the great anthropoids to whom he had looked for friendship and asylum. Dropping the body of the girl to the ground, the bull turned to battle anew for possession of his expensive prize, but this time he looked for an easy conquest. He too recognized Korak. Had he not chased him away from the amphitheater without even having to lay a fang or paw upon him? With lowered head and bulging shoulders he rushed headlong for the smooth-skinned creature who was daring to question his right to his prey. They met head-on like two charging bulls, to go down together tearing and striking. Korak forgot his knife. Rage and bloodlust such as his could be satisfied only by the feel of hot flesh between rending fangs, by the gush of new life blood against his bare skin, for though he did not realize it, Korak the killer was fighting for something more compelling than hate or revenge. He was a great male fighting another male for a she of his own kind. So impetuous was the attack of the man-ape that he found his hold before the anthropoid could prevent him, a savage hold with strong jaws closed upon a pulsing jugular, and there he clung with closed eyes, while his fingers sought another hold upon the shaggy throat. It was then that Miriam opened her eyes. At the sight before her they went wide. "Korak," she cried. "Korak, my Korak. I knew that you would come. Kill him, Korak. Kill him." And with flashing eyes and heaving bosom the girl, coming to her feet, ran to Korak's side to encourage him. Nearby lay the killer's spear, where he had flung it as he charged the ape. The girl saw it and snatched it up. No faintness overcame her in the face of this battle primeval at her feet. For her, there was no hysterical reaction from the nerve strain of her own personal encounter with the bull. She was excited but cool and entirely unafraid. Her Korak was battling with another Mangani that would have stolen her, but she did not seek the safety of an overhanging bough there to watch the battle from afar as would a she Mangani. Instead, she placed the point of Korak's spear against the bull ape's side and plunged the sharp point deep into the savage heart. Korak had not needed her aid, for the great bull had been already as good as dead, with the blood gushing from his torn jugular, but Korak rose, smiling with a word of approbation for his helper. How tall and fine she was! Had she changed suddenly within the few hours of his absence, or had his battle with the ape affected his vision? He might have been looking at Miriam through new eyes for the many startling and wonderful surprises his gaze revealed. How long it had been since he had found her in her father's village, a little Arab girl he did not know, for time is of no import in the jungle, and so he had kept no track of the passing days. But he realized, as he looked upon her now, that she was no longer such a little girl as he had first seen playing with Geeka beneath the great tree just within the palisade. The change must have been very gradual to have eluded his notice until now, and what was it that had caused him to realize it so suddenly? His gaze wandered from the girl to the body of the dead bull. For the first time there flashed to his understanding the explanation of the reason for the girl's attempted abduction. Korak's eyes went wide, and then they closed to narrow slits of rage as he stood glaring down upon the abysmal brute at his feet. When next his glance rose to Miriam's face, a slow flush suffused his own. Now indeed was he looking upon her through new eyes, the eyes of a man looking upon a maid. Akut had come up just as Miriam had speared Korak's antagonist. The exultation of the old ape was keen. He strutted stiff-legged and truculent about the body of the fallen enemy. He growled and upcurved his long, flexible lip. His hair bristled. He was paying no attention to Miriam and Korak. Back in the uttermost recesses of his little brain, something was stirring, something which the sight and smell of the great bull had aroused. The outward manifestation of the germinating idea was one of bestial rage, but the inner sensations were pleasurable in the extreme. The scent of the great bull and the sight of his huge and hairy figure had wakened in the heart of Akut a longing for the companionship of his own kind, so Korak was not alone undergoing a change. And Miriam? She was a woman. It is woman's divine right to love. Always she had loved Korak. He was her big brother. Miriam alone underwent no change. She was still happy in the companionship of her Korak. She still loved him as a sister loves an indulgent brother, and she was very, very proud of him. In all the jungle there was no other creature so strong, so handsome, or so brave. Korak came close to her. There was a new light in his eyes as she looked up into them, but she did not understand it. She did not realize how close they were to maturity, nor aught of all the difference in their lives the look in Korak's eyes might mean. Miriam, he whispered, and his voice was husky as he laid a brown hand upon her bare shoulder. Miriam, suddenly he crushed her to him. She looked up into his face, laughing, and then he bent and kissed her full upon the mouth. Even then she did not understand. She did not recall ever having been kissed before. It was very nice. Miriam liked it. She thought it was Korak's way of showing how glad he was that the great ape had not succeeded in running away with her. She was glad too, so she put her arms about the killer's neck and kissed him again and again. Then, discovering the doll in his belt, she transferred it to her own possession, kissing it as she had kissed Korak. Korak wanted her to say something. He wanted to tell her how he loved her, but the emotion of his love choked him, and the vocabulary of the Mangani was limited. There came a sudden interruption. It was from Akut, a sudden low growl, no louder than those he had been giving vent to the while he pranced about the dead bull, nor half so loud in fact, but of a timbre that bore straight to the perceptive faculties of the jungle beast ingrained in Korak. It was a warning. Korak looked quickly up from the glorious vision of the sweet face so close to his. Now his other faculties awoke. His ears, his nostrils were on the alert. Something was coming. The killer moved to Akut's side. Miriam was just behind them. The three stood like carved statues, gazing into the leafy tangle of the jungle. The noise that had attracted their attention increased, and presently a great ape broke through the underbrush, a few paces from where they stood. The beast halted at sight of them. He gave a warning grunt back over his shoulder, and a moment later, coming cautiously, another bull appeared. He was followed by others, both bulls and females with young, until 20 hairy monsters stood glaring at the three. It was the tribe of the dead king ape. Akut was the first to speak. He pointed to the body of the dead bull. "Korak, mighty fighter, has killed your king," he grunted. "There is none greater in all the jungle than Korak, son of Tarzan. Now Korak is king. What bull is greater than Korak?" It was a challenge to any bull who might care to question Korak's right to the kingship. The apes jabbered and chattered and growled among themselves for a time. At last a young bull came slowly forward, rocking upon his short legs, bristling, growling, terrible. The beast was enormous, and in the full prime of his strength. He belonged to that almost extinct species for which white men have long sought upon the information of the natives of the more inaccessible jungles. Even the natives seldom see these great, hairy, primordial men. Korak advanced to meet the monster. He, too, was growling. In his mind a plan was revolving. To close with this powerful and tired brute after having just passed through a terrific battle with another of his kind would have been to tempt defeat. He must find an easier way to victory. Crouching, he prepared to meet the charge which he knew would soon come, nor did he have long to wait. His antagonist paused only for sufficient time to permit him to recount for the edification of the audience and the confounding of Korak a brief resume of his former victories, of his prowess, and of what he was about to do to this puny Tarmangani. Then he charged. With clutching fingers and wide-open jaws he came down upon the waiting Korak with the speed of an express train. Korak did not move until the great arms swung to embrace him. Then he dropped low beneath them, swung a terrific right to the side of the beast's jaw as he sidestepped his rushing body, and swinging quickly about stood ready over the fallen ape where he sprawled upon the ground. It was a surprised anthropoid that attempted to scramble to its feet. Froth flecked its hideous lips, red were the little eyes, blood-curdling roars tumbled from the deep chest, but it did not reach its feet. The killer stood waiting above it, and the moment that the hairy chin came upon the proper level, another blow that would have felled an ox sent the ape over backward. Again and again the beast struggled to arise, but each time the mighty Tarmangani stood waiting with ready fist and pile-driver blow to bowl him over. Weaker and weaker became the efforts of the bull. Blood smeared his face and breast. A red stream trickled from nose and mouth. The crowd that had cheered him on at first with savage yells, now jeered him. Their approbation was for the Tarmangani. Kagoda inquired Korak, as he sent the bull down once more. Again the stubborn bull essayed to scramble to his feet. Again the killer struck him a terrific blow. Again he put the question, Kagoda, have you had enough? For a moment the bull lay motionless. Then from between battered lips came the single word, Kagoda. Then rise and go back among your people, said Korak. I do not wish to be king among people who once drove me from them. Keep your own ways and we will keep ours. When we meet, we may be friends, but we shall not live together. An old bull came slowly toward the killer. You have killed our king, he said. You have defeated him who would have been king. You could have killed him had you wished. What shall we do for a king? Korak turned toward Akut. There is your king, he said. But Akut did not want to be separated from Korak. Although he was anxious enough to remain with his own kind, he wanted Korak to remain too, he said as much. The youth was thinking of Miriam, of what would be best and safest for her. If Akut went away with the apes, there would be but one to watch over and protect her. On the other hand, were they to join the tribe, he would never feel safe to leave Miriam behind when he went out to hunt, for the passions of the ape folk are not ever well controlled. Even a female might develop an insane hatred for the slender white girl and kill her during Korak's absence. We will live near you, he said at last. When you change your hunting ground, we will change ours, Miriam and I, and so remain near you, but we shall not dwell among you. Akut raised objections to this plan. He did not wish to be separated from Korak. At first he refused to leave his human friend for the companionship of his own kind. But when he saw the last of the tribe wandering off into the jungle again, and his glance rested upon the lithe figure of the dead king's young mate, as she cast admiring glances at her lord's successor, the call of blood would not be denied. With a farewell glance toward his beloved Korak, he turned and followed the she-ape into the labyrinthine mazes of the wood. After Korak had left the village of the blacks following his last thieving expedition, the screams of his victim and those of the other women and children had brought the warriors in from the forest and the river. Great was the excitement and hot was the rage of the men when they learned that the white devil had again entered their homes, frightened their women, and stolen arrows and ornaments and food. Even their superstitious fear of this weird creature who hunted with a huge bull ape was overcome in their desire to wreak vengeance upon him and rid themselves for good and all of the menace of his presence in the jungle. And so it was that a score of the fleetest and most doughty warriors of the tribe set out in pursuit of Korak and Akut but a few minutes after they had left the scene of the killer's many depredations. The youth and the ape had traveled slowly and with no precautions against a successful pursuit, nor was their attitude of careless indifference to the blacks at all remarkable. So many similar raids had gone unpunished that the two had come to look upon the Negroes with contempt. The return journey led them straight upwind, the result being that the scent of their pursuers was borne away from them, so they proceeded upon their way in total ignorance of the fact that tireless trackers, but little less expert in the mysteries of woodcraft than themselves, were dogging their trail with savage insistence. The little party of warriors was led by Kovudu, the chief, a middle-aged savage of exceptional cunning and bravery. It was he who first came within sight of the quarry which they had followed for hours by the mysterious methods of their almost uncanny powers of observation, intuition, and even scent. Kovudu and his men came upon Korak, Akut, and Miriam after the killing of the king ape, the noise of the combat having led them at last straight to their quarry. The sight of the slender white girl had amazed the savage chief and held him gazing at the trio for a moment before ordering his warriors to rush out upon their prey. In that moment it was that the great apes came, and again the blacks remained awestruck witnesses to the palaver and the battle between Korak and the young bull. But now the apes had gone, and the white youth and the white maid stood alone in the jungle. One of Kovudu's men leaned close to the ear of his chief. "Look," he whispered, and pointed to something that dangled at the girl's side. "When my brother and I were slaves in the village of the sheikh, my brother made that thing for the sheikh's little daughter. She played with it always and called it after my brother, whose name is Gika. Just before we escaped, someone came and struck down the sheikh, stealing his daughter away. If this is she, the sheikh will pay you well for her return." Korak's arm had again gone around the shoulders of Miriam. Love raced hot through his young veins. Civilization was but a half-remembered state, London as remote as ancient Rome. In all the world there were but they two, Korak the killer and Miriam his mate. Again he drew her close to him and covered her willing lips with his hot kisses. And then from behind him broke a hideous bedlam of savage war cries, and a score of shrieking blacks were upon them. Korak turned to give battle. Miriam with her own light spear stood by his side. An avalanche of barbed missiles flew about them. One pierced Korak's shoulder, another his leg, and he went down. Miriam was unscathed, for the blacks had intentionally spared her. Now they rushed forward to finish Korak and make good the girl's capture, but as they came, there came also from another point in the jungle the great Akut, and at his heels the huge bulls of his new kingdom. Snarling and roaring they rushed upon the black warriors when they saw the mischief they had already wrought. Kovudu, realizing the danger of coming to close quarters with these mighty ape men, seized Miriam and called upon his warriors to retreat. For a time the apes followed them, and several of the blacks were badly mauled and one killed before they succeeded in escaping. Nor would they have gotten off thus easily had Akut not been more concerned with the condition of the wounded Korak than with the fate of the girl, upon whom he had always looked as more or less of an interloper and an unquestioned burden. Korak lay bleeding and unconscious when Akut reached his side. The great ape tore the heavy spears from his flesh, licked the wounds, and then carried his friend to the lofty shelter that Korak had constructed for Miriam. Further than this, the brute could do nothing. Nature must accomplish the rest unaided, or Korak must die. He did not die, however. For days he lay helpless with fever, while Akut and the apes hunted close by that they might protect him from such birds and beasts as might reach his lofty retreat. Occasionally Akut brought him juicy fruits which helped to slake his thirst and allay his fever, and little by little his powerful constitution overcame the effects of the spear thrusts. The wounds healed and his strength returned. All during his rational moments, as he had lain upon the soft furs which lined Miriam's nest, he had suffered more acutely from fears for Miriam than from the pain of his own wounds. For her he must live. For her he must regain his strength that he might set out in search of her. What had the blacks done to her? Did she still live, or had they sacrificed her to their lust for torture and human flesh? Korak almost trembled with terror as the most hideous possibilities of the girl's fate suggested themselves to him out of his knowledge of the customs of Kovudu's tribe. The days dragged their weary lengths along, but at last he had sufficiently regained his strength to crawl from the shelter and make his way unaided to the ground. Now he lived more upon raw meat, for which he was entirely dependent on Akut's skill and generosity. With the meat diet his strength returned more rapidly, and at last he felt that he was fit to undertake the journey to the village of the blacks. Chapter 12. Two tall, bearded white men moved cautiously through the jungle from their camp beside a wide river. They were Carl Jensen and Sven Malbien, but little altered in appearance since the day, years before, that they in their safari had been so badly frightened by Korak and Akut as the former sought haven with them. Every year had they come into the jungle to trade with the natives, or to rob them, to hunt and trap, or to guide other white men in the land they knew so well. Always since their experience with the sheikh had they operated at a safe distance from his territory. Now they were closer to his village than they had been for years, yet safe enough from discovery owing to the uninhabited nature of the intervening jungle, and the fear and enmity of Kovudu's people for the sheikh, who in time past had raided and all but exterminated the tribe. This year they had come to trap live specimens for a European zoological garden, and today they were approaching a trap which they had set in the hope of capturing a specimen of the large baboons that frequented the neighborhood. As they approached the trap, they became aware from the noises emanating from its vicinity that their efforts had been crowned with success. The barking and screaming of hundreds of baboons could mean naught else than that one or more of their number had fallen a victim to the allurements of the bait. The extreme caution of the two men was prompted by former experiences with the intelligent and dog-like creatures with which they had to deal. More than one trapper has lost his life in battle with enraged baboons who will hesitate to attack nothing upon one occasion, while upon another a single gunshot will disperse hundreds of them. Heretofore the Swedes had always watched near by their trap, for as a rule only the stronger bulls are thus caught, since in their greediness they prevent the weaker from approaching the covered bait. And when once within the ordinary rude trap, woven on the spot of interlaced branches, they are able, with the aid of their friends upon the outside, to demolish their prison and escape. But in this instance the trappers had utilized a special steel cage which could withstand all the strength and cunning of a baboon. It was only necessary, therefore, to drive away the herd which they knew were surrounding the prison, and wait for their boys who were even now following them to the trap. As they came within sight of the spot, they found conditions precisely as they had expected. A large male was battering frantically against the steel wires of the cage that held him captive. Upon the outside several hundred other baboons were tearing and tugging in his aid, and all were roaring and jabbering and barking at the top of their lungs. But what neither the Swedes nor the baboons saw was the half-naked figure of a youth hidden in the foliage of a nearby tree. He had come upon the scene at almost the same instant as Jensen and Malbine, and was watching the activities of the baboons with every mark of interest. Korak's relations with the baboons had never been over-friendly. A species of armed toleration had marked their occasional meetings. The baboons and Akut had walked stiff-legged and growling past one another, while Korak had maintained a bared-fang neutrality. So now he was not greatly disturbed by the predicament of their king. Curiosity prompted him to tarry a moment, and in that moment his quick eyes caught the unfamiliar coloration of the clothing of the two Swedes behind a bush not far from him. Now he was all alertness. Who were these interlopers? What was their business in the jungle of the Mangani? Korak slunk noiselessly around them to a point where he might get their scent as well as a better view of them, and scarce had he done so when he recognized them. They were the men who had fired upon him years before. His eyes blazed. He could feel the hairs upon his scalp stiffen at the roots. He watched them with the intentness of a panther about to spring upon its prey. He saw them rise and, shouting, attempt to frighten away the baboons as they approached the cage. Then one of them raised his rifle and fired into the midst of the surprised and angry herd. For an instant Korak thought that the baboons were about to charge, but two more shots from the rifles of the white men sent them scampering into the trees. Then the two Europeans advanced upon the cage. Korak thought that they were going to kill the king. He cared nothing for the king, but he cared less for the two white men. The king had never attempted to kill him, the white men had. The king was a denizen of his own beloved jungle, the white men were aliens. His loyalty therefore was to the baboon against the human. He could speak the language of the baboon. It was identical to that of the great apes. Across the clearing he saw the jabbering horde watching. Raising his voice he shouted to them. The white men turned at the sound of this new factor behind them. They thought it was another baboon that had circled them, but though they searched the trees with their eyes, they saw nothing of the now silent figure hidden by the foliage. Again Korak shouted. "I am the killer," he cried. "These men are my enemies and yours. I will help you free your king. Run out upon the strangers when you see me do so, and together we will drive them away and free your king." And from the baboons came a great chorus, "We will do what you say, Korak." Dropping from his tree, Korak ran toward the two Swedes, and at the same instant 300 baboons followed his example. At sight of the strange apparition of the half-naked white warrior rushing upon them with uplifted spear, Jensen and Malbine raised their rifles and fired at Korak, but in the excitement both missed, and a moment later the baboons were upon them. Now their only hope of safety lay in escape, and dodging here and there, fighting off the great beasts that leaped upon their backs. They ran into the jungle. Even then they would have died but for the coming of their men, whom they met a couple of 100 yards from the cage. Once the white men had turned in flight, Korak gave them no further attention, turning instead to the imprisoned baboon. The fastenings of the door that had eluded the mental powers of the baboons yielded their secret immediately to the human intelligence of the killer, and a moment later the king baboon stepped forth to liberty. He wasted no breath in thanks to Korak, nor did the young man expect thanks. He knew that none of the baboons would ever forget his service, though as a matter of fact he did not care if they did. What he had done had been prompted by a desire to be revenged upon the two white men. The baboons could never be of service to him. Now they were racing in the direction of the battle that was being waged between their fellows and the followers of the two Swedes, and as the din of battle subsided in the distance, Korak turned and resumed his journey toward the village of Kovudu. On the way he came upon a herd of elephants standing in an open forest glade. Here the trees were too far apart to permit Korak to travel through the branches, a trail he much preferred, not only because of its freedom from dense underbrush and the wider field of vision it gave him, but from pride in his arboreal ability. It was exhilarating to swing from tree to test the prowess of his mighty muscles, to reap the pleasurable fruits of his hard-won agility. Korak joyed in the thrills of the high-flung upper terraces of the great forest where, unhampered and unhindered, he might laugh down upon the great brutes who must keep forever to the darkness and the gloom of the musty soil. But here, in this open glade where Tantor flapped his giant ears and swayed his huge bulk from side to side, the ape-man must pass along the surface of the ground, a pygmy amongst giants. A great bull raised his trunk to rattle a low warning as he sensed the coming of an intruder. His weak eyes roved hither and thither, but it was his keen scent and acute hearing which first located the ape-man. The herd moved restlessly, prepared for fight, for the old bull had caught the scent of man. "Peace," Tantor called the killer. "It is I, Korak Tarmangani." The bull lowered his trunk, and the herd resumed their interrupted meditations. Korak passed within a foot of the great bull. A sinuous trunk undulated toward him, touching his brown hide in a half-caress. Korak slapped the great shoulder affectionately as he went by. For years he had been upon good terms with Tantor and his people. Of all the jungle folk he loved best the mighty pachyderm, the most peaceful and at the same time the most terrible of them all. The gentle gazelle feared him not, yet Numa, lord of the jungle, gave him a wide berth. Among the younger bulls, the cows and the cows and the calves, Korak wound his way. Now and then another trunk would run out to touch him, and once a playful calf grasped his legs and upset him. The afternoon was almost spent when Korak arrived at the village of Kovudu. There were many natives lolling in shady spots beside the conical huts or beneath the branches of the several trees which had been left standing within the enclosure. Warriors were in evidence upon hand. It was not a good time for a lone enemy to prosecute a search through the village. Korak determined to await the coming of darkness. He was a match for many warriors, but he could not, unaided, overcome an entire tribe, not even for his beloved Miriam. While he waited among the branches and foliage of a nearby tree, he searched the village constantly with his keen eyes, and twice he circled it, sniffing the vagrant breezes which puffed erratically from first one point of the compass and then another. Among the various stenches peculiar to a native village, the ape-man's sensitive nostrils were finally rewarded by cognizance of the delicate aroma which marked the presence of her he sought. Miriam was there in one of those huts. But which one he could not know without closer investigation, and so he waited, with the dogged patience of a beast of prey, until night had fallen. The campfires of the blacks dotted the gloom with little points of light, casting their feeble rays in tiny circles of luminosity that brought into glistening relief the naked bodies of those who lay or squatted about them. It was then that Korak slid silently from the tree that had hidden him and dropped lightly to the ground within the enclosure. Keeping well in the shadows of the huts, he commenced a systematic search of the village ears, eyes and nose constantly upon the alert for the first intimation of the near presence of Miriam. His progress must of necessity be slow, since not even the keen-eared curs of the savages must guess the presence of a stranger within the gates. How close he came to a detection on several occasions the killer well knew from the restless whining of several of them. It was not until he reached the back of a hut at the head of the wide village street that Korak caught again, plainly, the scent of Miriam. With nose close to the thatched wall, Korak sniffed eagerly about the structure, tense and palpitant as a hunting hound. Toward the front and the door he made his way when once his nose had assured him that Miriam lay within, but as he rounded the side and came within view of the entrance, he saw a burly negro armed with a long spear squatting at the portal of the girl's prison. The fellow's back was toward him, his figure outlined against the glow of cooking fires further down the street. He was alone. The nearest of his fellows were beside a fire 60 or 70 feet beyond. To enter the hut, Korak must either silence the sentry or pass him unnoticed. The danger in the accomplishment of the former alternative lay in the practical certainty of alarming the warriors nearby and bringing them and the balance of the village down upon him. To achieve the latter appeared practically impossible. To you or me it would have been impossible, but Korak, the killer, was not as you or I. There was a good 12 inches of space between the broad back of the black and the frame of the doorway. Could Korak pass through behind the savage warrior without detection? The light that fell upon the glistening ebony of the sentry's black skin fell also upon the light brown of Korak's. Should one of the many further down the street chance to look long in this direction, they must surely note the tall, light-colored, moving figure, but Korak depended upon their interest in their own gossip to hold their attention fast where it already lay, and upon the firelight near them to prevent them seeing too plainly at a distance into the darkness at the village end where his work lay. Flattened against the side of the hut, yet not arousing a single warning rustle from its dried thatching, the killer came closer and closer to the watcher. Now he was at his shoulder. Now he had wormed his sinuous way behind him. He could feel the heat of the naked body against his knees. He could hear the man breathe. He marveled that the dull-witted creature had not long since been alarmed, but the fellow sat there as ignorant of the presence of another, as though that other had not existed. Korak moved scarcely more than an inch at a time, then he would stand motionless for a moment. Thus was he worming his way behind the guard when the latter straightened up, opened his cavernous mouth in a wide yawn, and stretched his arms above his head. Korak stood rigid as stone. Another step and he would be within the hut. The black lowered his arms and relaxed. Behind him was the framework of the doorway. Often before had it supported his sleepy head, and now he leaned back to enjoy the forbidden pleasure of a cat nap. But instead of the door frame, his head and shoulders came in contact with the warm flesh of a pair of living legs. The exclamation of surprise that almost burst from his lips was throttled in his throat by steel-thewed fingers that closed about his windpipe with the suddenness of thought. The black struggled to arise, to turn upon the creature that had seized him, to wriggle from its hold, but all to no purpose. As he had been held in a mighty vise of iron, he could not move, he could not move, he could not scream. His awful fingers at his throat, but closed more and more tightly. His eyes bulged from their sockets. His face turned an ashy blue. Presently he relaxed once more, this time in the final dissolution from which there is no quickening. Korak propped the dead body against the doorframe. There it sat, lifelike in the gloom. Then the ape-man turned and glided into the Stygian darkness of the hut's interior. "Miriam," he whispered. "Korak." "My Korak," came an answering cry, subdued by fear of alarming her captors and half-stifled by a sob of joyful welcome. The youth knelt and cut the bonds that held the girl's wrists and ankles. A moment later he had lifted her to her feet, and grasping her by the hand led her towards the entrance. Outside, the grim sentinel of death kept his grisly vigil. Sniffing at his dead feet whined a mangy native cur. At sight of the two emerging from the hut, the beast gave an ugly snarl, and an instant later, as it caught the scent of the strange white man, it raised a series of excited yelps. Instantly the warriors at the nearby fire were attracted. They turned their heads in the direction of the commotion. It was impossible that they should fail to see the white skins of the fugitives. Korak slunk quickly into the shadows at the hut side, drawing Miriam with him, but he was too late. The blacks had seen enough to arouse their suspicions, and a dozen of them were now running to investigate. The yapping cur was still at Korak's heels, leading the searchers unerringly in pursuit. The youth struck viciously at the brute with his long spear, but, long accustomed to dodging blows, the wily creature made a most uncertain target. Other blacks had been alarmed by the running and shouting of their companions, and now the entire population of the village was swarming up the street to assist in the search. Their first discovery was the dead body of the sentry, and a moment later one of the bravest of them had entered the hut and discovered the absence of the prisoner. These startling announcements filled the blacks with a combination of terror and rage, but seeing no foe in evidence, they were enabled to permit their rage to get the better of their terror, and so the leaders, pushed on by those behind them, ran rapidly around the hut in the direction of the yapping of the mangy cur. Here they found a single white warrior making away with their captive, and recognizing him as the author of numerous raids and indignities, and believing that they had him cornered and at a disadvantage, they charged savagely upon him. Korak, seeing that they were discovered, lifted Miriam to his shoulders and ran for the tree which would give them egress from the village. He was handicapped in his flight by the weight of the girl, whose legs would but scarce bear her weight, to say nothing of maintaining her in rapid flight, for the tightly drawn bonds that had been about her ankles for so long had stopped circulation, and partially paralyzed her extremities. Had this not been the case, the escape of the two would have been a feat of little moment, since Miriam was scarcely a whit less agile than Korak, and fully as much at home in the trees as he. But with the girl on his shoulder, Korak could not both run and fight to advantage. And the result was that before he had covered half the distance to the tree, a score of native curs, attracted by the yelping of their mate and the yells and shouts of their masters, had closed in upon the fleeing white man, snapping at his legs, and at last succeeding in tripping him. As he went down, the hyena-like brutes were upon him, and as he struggled to his feet, the blacks closed in. A couple of them seized the clawing, biting Miriam and subdued her. A blow upon the head was sufficient. For the ape-man, they found more drastic measures would be necessary. Weighted down as he was by dogs and warriors, he still managed to struggle to his feet. To right and left he swung crushing blows to the faces of his human antagonists. To the dogs he paid not the slightest attention, other than to seize the more persistent and wring their necks with a single quick movement of the wrist. A knob stick aimed at him by an Ibon Hercules he caught and wrested from his antagonist, and then the blacks experienced to the full the possibilities for punishment that lay within those smooth flowing muscles beneath the velvet brown skin of the strange white giant. He rushed among them with all the force and ferocity of a bull-elephant gone mad. Hither and thither he charged, striking down the few who had the temerity to stand against him, and it was evident that unless a chance spear thrust brought him down, he would rout the entire village and regain his prize. But old Kovudu was not to be so easily robbed of the ransom which the girl represented, and seeing that their attack, which had up to now resulted in a series of individual combats with the white warrior, he called his tribesmen off, and forming them in a compact body about the girl and the two who watched over her, bid them do nothing more than repel the assaults of the ape-man. Again and again Korak rushed against this human barricade bristling with spear points. Again and again he was repulsed, often with severe wounds to caution him to greater wariness. From head to foot he was red with his own blood, and at last, weakening from the loss of it, he came to the bitter realization that alone he could do no more to succor his Miriam. Presently an idea flashed through his brain. He called aloud to the girl. She had regained consciousness now and replied. "Korak goes," he shouted, "but he will return and take you from the Gomangani. Goodbye, my Miriam. Korak will come for you again." "Goodbye," cried the girl. "Miriam will look for you until you come." Like a flash, and before they could know his intention or prevent him, Korak wheeled, raced across the village, and with a single leap disappeared into the foliage of the great tree that was his highroad to the village of Kovudu. A shower of spears followed him, but their only harvest was a taunting laugh flung back from out the darkness of the jungle. Chapter 13. Miriam, again bound and under heavy guard in Kovudu's own hut, saw the night pass and the new day come without bringing the momentarily looked-for return of Korak. She had no doubt but that he would come back, and less still that he would easily free her from her captivity. To her, Korak was little short of omnipotent. He embodied for her all that was finest and strongest and best in her savage world. She gloried in his prowess and worshipped him for the tender thoughtfulness that always had marked his treatment of her. No other within the ken of her memory had ever accorded her the love and gentleness that was his daily offering to her. Most of the gentler attributes of his early childhood had long since been forgotten in the fierce battle for existence which the customs of the mysterious jungle had forced upon him. He was more often savage and bloodthirsty than tender and kindly. His other friends of the wild looked for no gentle tokens of his affection. That he would hunt with them and fight for them was sufficient. If he growled and showed his fighting fangs when they trespassed upon his inalienable rights to the fruits of his kills, they felt no anger toward him, only greater respect for the efficient and the fit, for him who could not only kill but protect the flesh of his kill. But toward Miriam he always had shown more of his human side. He killed primarily for her. It was to the feet of Miriam that he brought the fruits of his labors. It was for Miriam more than for himself that he squatted beside his flesh and growled ominously at whosoever dared sniff too closely to it. When he was cold in the dark days of rain, or thirsty in a prolonged drought, his discomfort engendered first of all thoughts of Miriam's welfare after she had been made warm, after her thirst had been slaked. Then he turned to the affair of ministering to his own wants. The softest skins fell gracefully from the graceful shoulders of his Miriam. The sweetest scented grasses lined her bower, where other soft furry pelts made hers the downiest couch in all the jungle. What wonder then that Miriam loved her Korak? But she loved him as a little sister might love a big brother who was very good to her. As yet she knew naught of the love of a maid for a man. So now as she lay waiting for him, she dreamed of him and of all that he meant to her. She compared him with the sheik, her father, and at thought of the stern, grizzled old Arab she shuddered. Even the savage blacks had been less harsh to her than he. Not understanding their tongues, she could not guess what purpose they had in keeping her a prisoner. She knew that man ate man, and she had expected to be eaten, but she had been with them for some time now, and no harm had befallen her. She did not know that a runner had been dispatched to the distant village of the sheikh to barter with him for a ransom. She did not know, nor did Kovidu, that the runner had never reached his destination, that he had fallen in with the safari of Jensen and Malbien, and with the talkativeness of a native to other natives had unfolded his whole mission to the black servants of the two Swedes. These had not been long in retailing the matter to their masters, and the result was that when the runner left their camp to continue his journey, he had scarce passed from sight before there came the report of a rifle, and he rolled lifeless into the underbrush with a bullet in his back. A few moments later, Malbien strolled back into the encampment, where he went to some pains to let it be known that he had had a shot at a fine buck and missed. The Swedes knew that their men hated them, and that an overt act against Kovidu would quickly be carried to the chief at the first opportunity. Nor were they sufficiently strong in either guns or loyal followers to risk antagonizing the wily old chief. Following this episode came the encounter with the baboons and the strange white savage who had allied himself with the beasts against the humans. Only by dint of masterful maneuvering and the expenditure of much power had the Swedes been able to repulse the infuriated apes, and even for hours afterward their camp was constantly besieged by hundreds of snarling, screaming devils. The Swedes, rifles in hand, repelled numerous savage charges which lacked only efficient leadership to have rendered them as effective in results as they were terrifying in appearance. Time and time again the two men thought they saw the smooth-skinned body of the wild ape man moving among the baboons in the forest, and the belief that he might head a charge upon them proved most disquieting. They would have given much for a clean shot at him, for to him they attributed the loss of their specimen and the ugly attitude of the baboons toward them. "The fellow must be the same we fired on several years ago," said Malbien. "That time he was accompanied by a gorilla. Did you get a good look at him, Carl?" "Yes," replied Jensen. "He was not 5 paces from me when I fired at him. He appears to be an intelligent-looking European and not much more than a lad. There is nothing of the imbecile or degenerate in his features or expression, as is usually true in similar cases. Where some lunatic escapes into the woods and by living in filth and nakedness wins the title of wild man among the peasants of the neighborhood. No. This fellow is of different stuff and so infinitely more to be feared. As much as I should like a shot at him, I hope he stays away. Should he ever deliberately lead a charge against us, I wouldn't give much for our chances if we happened to fail to bag him at the first rush." But the white giant did not appear again to lead the baboons against them, and finally the angry brutes themselves wandered off into the jungle, leaving the frightened safari in peace. The next day the Swedes set out for Kovidu's village, bent on securing possession of the person of the white girl whom Kovidu's runner had told them lay captive in the chief's village. How they were to accomplish their end they did not know. Force was out of the question, though they would not have hesitated to use it had they possessed it. In former years they had marched roughshod over enormous areas, taking toll by brute force even when kindliness or diplomacy would have accomplished more. But now they were in bad straits, so bad that they had shown their true colors scarce twice in a year, and then only when they came upon an isolated village, weak in numbers and poor in courage. Kovidu was not as these, and though his village was in a way remote from the more populous district to the north, his power was such that he maintained an acknowledged suzerainty over the thin thread of villages which connected him with the savage lords to the north. To have antagonized him would have spelled ruin for the Swedes. It would have meant that they might never reach civilization by the northern route. To the west, the village of the sheik lay directly in their path, barring them effectually. And to the east, the trail was unknown to them, and to the south there was no trail. So the two Swedes approached the village of Kovidu with friendly words upon their tongues and deep craft in their hearts. Their plans were well made. There was no mention of the white prisoner. They chose to pretend that they were not aware that Kovidu had a white prisoner. They exchanged gifts with the old chief, haggling with his plenipotentiaries over the value of what they were to receive for what they gave, as is customary and proper when one has no ulterior motives. Unwarranted generosity would have aroused suspicion. During the palaver which followed, they retailed the gossip of the villages through which they had passed, receiving in exchange such news as Kovidu possessed. The palaver was long and tiresome, as these native ceremonies always are to Europeans. Kovudu made no mention of his prisoner, and from his generous offers of guides and presents seemed anxious to assure himself of the speedy departure of his guests. It was Malbeen who, quite casually near the close of their talk, mentioned the fact that the sheik was dead. Kovudu evinced interest and surprise. "You did not know it?" asked Malbeen. "That is strange. It was during the last moon. He fell from his horse when the beast stepped in a hole. The horse fell upon him. When his men came up, the sheik was quite dead." Kovudu scratched his head. He was much disappointed. No sheik meant no ransom for the white girl. Now she was worthless, unless he utilized her for a feast or a mate. The latter thought aroused him. He spat at a small beetle crawling through the dust before him. He eyed Malbeen appraisingly. These white men were peculiar. They traveled far from their own villages without women. Yet he knew they cared for women. But how much did they care for them? That was the question that disturbed Kovudu. "I know where there is a white girl," he said, unexpectedly. "If you wish to buy her, she may be had cheap." Malbeen shrugged. "We have troubles enough, Kovudu," he said, "without burdening ourselves with an old she-hyena, and as for paying for one," Malbeen snapped his fingers in derision. "She is young," said Kovudu, "and good-looking." The Swedes laughed. "There are no good-looking white women in the jungle," Kovudu said Jensen. "You should be ashamed to try to make fun of old friends." Kovudu sprang to his feet. "Come," he said, "I will show you that she is all I say." Malbeen and Jensen rose to follow him, and as they did so their eyes met, and Malbeen slowly drooped one of his lids in a sly wink. Together they followed Kovudu toward his hut. In the dim interior they discerned the figure of a woman lying bound upon a sleeping mat. Malbeen took a single glance and turned away. "She must be 1,000 years old, Kovudu," he said, as he left the hut. "She is young," cried the savage. "It is dark in here. You cannot see. Wait, I will have her brought out into the sunlight," and he commanded the two warriors who watched the girl to cut the bonds from her ankles and lead her forth for inspection. Malbeen and Jensen evinced no eagerness, though both were fairly bursting with it not to see the girl but to obtain possession of her. They cared not if she had the face of a marmoset, or the figure of pot-bellied Kovudu himself. All that they wished to know was that she was the girl who had been stolen from the sheik several years before. They thought that they would recognize her for such if she was indeed the same, but even so the testimony of the runner Kovudu had sent to the sheik was such as to assure them that the girl was the one they had once before attempted to abduct. As Miriam was brought forth from the darkness of the hut's interior, the two men turned with every appearance of disinterestedness to glance at her. It was with difficulty that Malbeen suppressed an ejaculation of astonishment. The girl's beauty fairly took his breath from him, but instantly he recovered his poise and turned to Kovudu. "Well," he said to the old chief. "Is she not both young and good-looking?" asked Kovudu. "She is not old," replied Malbeen, "but even so she will be a burden. We did not come from the north after wives. There are more than enough there for us." Miriam stood looking straight at the white men. She expected nothing from them. They were to her as much enemies as the black men. She hated and feared them all. Malbeen spoke to her in Arabic. "We are friends," he said. "Would you like to have us take you away from here?" Slowly and dimly, as though from a great distance, recollection of the once familiar tongue returned to her. "I should like to go free," she said, "and go back to Korak." "You would like to go with us?" persisted Malbeen. "No," said Miriam. Malbeen turned to Kovudu. "She does not wish to go with us," he said. "You are men," returned the black. "Can you not take her by force?" "It would only add to our troubles," replied the Swede. "No, Kovudu, we do not wish her, though. If you wish to be rid of her, we will take her away because of our friendship for you." Now Kovudu knew that he had made a sale. They wanted her. So he commenced to bargain, and in the end the person of Miriam passed from the possession of the black chieftain into that of the two Swedes in consideration of 6 yards of American, 3 empty brass cartridge shells, and a shiny new jackknife from New Jersey. And all but Miriam were more than pleased with the bargain. Kovudu stipulated but a single condition, and that was that the Europeans were to leave his village and take the girl with them as early the next morning as they could get started. After the sale was consummated, he did not hesitate to explain his reasons for this demand. He told them of the strenuous attempt of the girl's savage mate to rescue her, and suggested that the sooner they got her out of the country, the more likely they were to retain possession of her. Miriam was again bound and placed under guard, but this time in the tent of the Swedes. Malbin talked to her, trying to persuade her to accompany them willingly. He told her that they would return her to her own village, but when he discovered that she would rather die than go back to the old sheik, he assured her that they would not take her there, nor, as a matter of fact, had they had an intention of so doing. As he talked with the girl, the Swede feasted his eyes upon the beautiful lines of her face and figure. She had grown tall and straight and slender toward maturity since he had seen her in the sheik's village on that long gone day. For years she had represented to him a certain fabulous reward. In his thoughts she had been but the personification of the pleasures and luxuries that many Franks would purchase. Now, as she stood before him pulsing with life and loveliness, she suggested other seductive and alluring possibilities. He came closer to her and laid his hand upon her. The girl shrank from him. He seized her and she struck him heavily in the mouth as he sought to kiss her. Then Jensen entered the tent. Malbin, he almost shouted, "You fool." Sven Malbin released his hold upon the girl and turned toward his companion. His face was red with mortification. "What the devil are you trying to do?" growled Jensen. "Would you throw away every chance for the reward? If we maltreat her, we not only couldn't collect a sou, but they'd send us to prison for our pains. I thought you had more sense, Malbin." "I'm not a wooden man," growled Malbin. "You'd better be," rejoined Jensen, "at least until we have delivered her over in safety and collected what will be coming to us." "Oh, hell," cried Malbin, "what's the use? They'll be glad enough to have her back. And by the time we get there with her, she'll be only too glad to keep her mouth shut. Why not?" "Because I say not," growled Jensen. "I've always let you boss things, Sven, but here's a case where what I say has got to go because I'm right and you're wrong, and we both know it." "You're getting damned virtuous all of a sudden," growled Malbin. "Perhaps you think I have forgotten about the innkeeper's daughter and little Silella and that nigger rat." "Shut up," snapped Jensen. "It's not a matter of virtue, and you are as well aware of that as I. I don't want to quarrel with you, but so help me God, Sven. You're not going to harm this girl if I have to kill you to prevent it. I've suffered and slaved and been nearly killed 40 times in the last 9 or 10 years trying to accomplish what luck has thrown at our feet at last. And now I'm not going to be robbed of the fruits of success, because you happen to be more of a beast than a man. Again, I warn you, Sven," and he tapped the revolver that swung in its holster at his hip. Malbin gave his friend an ugly look, shrugged his shoulders, and left the tent. Jensen turned to Miriam. "If he bothers you again, call me," he said. "I shall always be near." The girl had not understood the conversation that had been carried on by her two owners, for it had been in Swedish, but what Jensen had just said to her in Arabic she understood, and from it grasped an excellent idea of what had passed between the two. The expressions upon their faces, their gestures, and Jensen's final tapping of his revolver before Malbin had left the tent had all been eloquent of the seriousness of their altercation. Now, toward Jensen she looked for friendship, and with the innocence of youth she threw herself upon his mercy, begging him to set her free, that she might return to Korak and her jungle life, but she was doomed to another disappointment. For the man only laughed at her roughly and told her that if she tried to escape she would be punished by the very thing that he had just saved her from. All that night she lay listening for a signal from Korak. All about the jungle life moved through the darkness. To her sensitive ears came sounds that the others in the camp could not hear, sounds that she interpreted as we might interpret the speech of a friend, but not once came a single note that reflected the presence of Korak. But she knew that he would come. Nothing short of death itself could prevent her Korak from returning for her. What delayed him, though? When morning came again and the night had brought no succoring Korak, Miriam's faith and loyalty were still unshaken, though misgivings began to assail her as to the safety of her friend. It seemed unbelievable that serious mishap could have overtaken her wonderful Korak, who daily passed unscathed through all the terrors of the jungle. Yet morning came, the morning meal was eaten, the camp broken, and the disreputable safari of the Swedes was on the move northward with still no sign of the rescue the girl momentarily expected. All that day they marched, and the next, nor did Korak even so much as show himself to the patient little waiter moving, silently and stately, beside her hard captors. Malbin remained scowling and angry. He replied to Jensen's friendly advances in curt monosyllables. To Miriam he did not speak, but on several occasions she discovered him glaring at her from beneath half-closed lids greedily. The look sent a shudder through her. She hugged Dika closer to her breast and doubly regretted the knife that they had taken from her when she was captured by Kovudu. It was on the fourth day that Miriam began definitely to give up hope. Something had happened to Korak. She knew it. He would never come now, and these men would take her far away. Presently they would kill her. She would never see her Korak again. On this day the Swedes rested, for they had marched rapidly and their men were tired. Malbin and Jensen had gone from camp to hunt, taking different directions. They had been gone about an hour when the door of Miriam's tent was lifted and Malbin entered. The look of a beast was on his face. Chapter 14. With wide eyes fixed upon him, like a trapped creature horrified beneath the mesmeric gaze of a great serpent, the girl watched the approach of the man. Her hands were free, the Swedes having secured her with a length of ancient slave chain fastened at one end to an iron collar padlocked about her neck, and at the other to a long stake driven deep into the ground. Slowly Miriam shrank inch by inch toward the opposite end of the tent. Malbin followed her. His hands were extended and his fingers half-opened claw-like to seize her. His lips were parted and his breath came quickly, pantingly. The girl recalled Jensen's instructions to call him should Malbin molest her, but Jensen had gone into the jungle to hunt. Malbin had chosen his time well. Yet she screamed, loud and shrill, once, twice, a third time, before Malbin could leap across the tent and throttle her alarming cries with his brute fingers. Then she fought him as any jungle she might fight, with tooth and nail. The man found her no easy prey. In that slender young body, beneath the rounded curves and the fine, soft skin, lay the muscles of a young lioness, but Malbin was no weakling. His character and appearance were brutal, nor did they belie his brawn. He was of giant stature and of giant strength. Slowly he forced the girl back upon the ground, striking her in the face when she hurt him badly either with teeth or nails. Miriam struck back, but she was growing weaker from the choking fingers at her throat. Out in the jungle Jensen had brought down 2 bucks. His hunting had not carried him far afield, nor was he prone to permit it to do so. He was suspicious of Malbin. The very fact that his companion had refused to accompany him and elected instead to hunt alone in another direction would not, under ordinary circumstances, have seemed fraught with sinister suggestion, but Jensen knew Malbin well, and so having secured meat, he turned immediately back toward camp, while his boys brought in his kill. He had covered about half the return journey when a scream came faintly to his ears from the direction of camp. He halted to listen. It was repeated twice, then silence. With a muttered curse, Jensen broke into a rapid run. He wondered if he would be too late. What a fool Malbin was indeed to thus chance jeopardizing a fortune. Further away from camp than Jensen, and upon the opposite side, another heard Miriam's screams, a stranger who was not even aware of the proximity of white men, other than himself a hunter with a handful of sleek, black warriors. He, too, listened intently for a moment. That the voice was that of a woman in distress he could not doubt, and so he also hastened at a run in the direction of the affrighted voice, but he was much further away than Jensen, so that the latter reached the tent first. What the Swede found there roused no pity within his calloused heart, only anger against his fellow scoundrel. Miriam was still fighting off her attacker. Malbin still was showering blows upon her. Jensen, streaming foul curses upon his erstwhile friend, burst into the tent. Malbin, interrupted, dropped his victim and turned to meet Jensen's infuriated charge. He whipped a revolver from his hip. Jensen, anticipating the lightning move of the other's hand, drew almost simultaneously, and both men fired at once. Jensen was still moving toward Malbin at the time, but at the flash of the explosion he stopped. His revolver dropped from nerveless fingers. For a moment he staggered drunkenly. Deliberately Malbin put 2 more bullets into his friend's body at close range. Even in the midst of the excitement and her terror, Miriam found herself wondering at the tenacity of life which the hitman displayed. His eyes were closed, his head dropped forward upon his breast, his hands hung limply before him. Yet still he stood there upon his feet, though he reeled horribly. It was not until the 3rd bullet had found its mark within his body that he lunged forward upon his face. Then Malbin approached him and with an oath kicked him viciously. Then he returned once more to Miriam. Again he seized her, and at the same instant the flaps of the tent opened silently, and a tall white man stood in the aperture. Neither Miriam or Malbin saw the newcomer. The latter's back was toward him, while his body hid the stranger from Miriam's eyes. He crossed the tent quickly, stepping over Jensen's body. The first intimation Malbin had that he was not to carry out his design without further interruption was a heavy hand upon his shoulder. He wheeled to face an utter stranger, a tall, black-haired, grey-eyed stranger clad in khaki and pith helmet. Malbeen reached for his gun again, but another hand had been quicker than his, and he saw the weapon tossed to the ground at the side of the tent out of reach. "What is the meaning of this?" The stranger addressed his question to Miriam in a tongue she did not understand. She shook her head and spoke in Arabic. Instantly the man changed his question to that language. "These men are taking me away from Korak," explained the girl. "This one would have harmed me. The other, whom he had just killed, tried to stop him. They were both very bad men, but this one is the worse. If my Korak were here, he would kill him. I suppose you are like them, so you will not kill him." The stranger smiled. "He deserves killing," he said. "There is no doubt of that. Once I should have killed him, but not now. I will see, though, that he does not bother you any more." He was holding Malbeen in a grasp the giant Swede could not break, though he struggled to do so, and he was holding him as easily as Malbeen might have held a little child, yet Malbeen was a huge man, mightily thewed. The Swede began to rage and curse. He struck at his captor only to be twisted about and held at arm's length. Then he shouted to his boys to come and kill the stranger. In response, a dozen strange blacks entered the tent. They, too, were powerful, clean-limbed men, not at all like the mangy crew that followed the Swedes. "We have had enough foolishness," said the stranger to Malbeen. "You deserve death, but I am not the law. I know now who you are. I have heard of you before. You and your friend here bear a most unsavory reputation. We do not want you in our country. I shall let you go this time, but should you ever return, I shall take the law into my own hands. You understand?" Malbeen blustered and threatened, finishing by applying a most uncomplimentary name to his captor. For this he received a shaking that rattled his teeth. Those who know say that the most painful punishment that can be inflicted upon an adult male, short of injuring him, is a good, old-fashioned shaking. Malbeen received such a shaking. "Now get out," said the stranger, "and next time you see me, remember who I am." And he spoke a name in the Swede's ear, a name that more effectually subdued the scoundrel than many beatings. Then he gave him a push that carried him bodily through the tent doorway to sprawl upon the turf beyond. "Now," he said, turning toward Miriam, "who has the key to this thing about your neck?" The girl pointed to Jensen's body. "He carried it always," she said. The stranger searched the clothing on the corpse until he came upon the key. A moment more, Miriam was free. "Will you let me go back to my Korak?" she asked. "I will see that you are returned to your people," he replied. "Who are they and where is their village?" He had been eyeing her strange, barbaric garmenture wonderingly. From her speech she was evidently an Arab girl, but he had never before seen one thus clothed. "Who are your people? Who is Korak?" he asked again. "Korak? Why, Korak is an ape. I have no other people. Korak and I live in the jungle alone. Since Aht went to be king of the apes, she had always thus pronounced Akut's name, for so it had sounded to her when first she came with Korak and the ape. Korak could have been kind, but he would not. A questioning expression entered the stranger's eyes. He looked at the girl closely. "So Korak is an ape," he said. "And what, pray, are you?" "I am Miriam. I also am an ape." Was the stranger's only oral comment upon this startling announcement, but what he thought might have been partially interpreted through the pitying light that entered his eyes. He approached the girl and started to lay his hand upon her forehead. She drew back with a savage little growl. A smile touched his lips. "You need not fear me," he said. "I shall not harm you. I only wish to discover if you have fever, if you are entirely well. If you are, we will set forth in search of Korak." Miriam looked straight into the keen grey eyes. She must have found there an unquestionable assurance of the honorableness of their owner, for she permitted him to lay his palm upon her forehead and feel her pulse. Apparently she had no fever. "How long have you been an ape?" asked the man. "Since I was a little girl, many, many years ago, and Korak came and took me from my father, who was beating me. Since then I have lived in the trees with Korak and Aht." "Where in the jungle lives Korak?" asked the stranger. Miriam pointed with a sweep of her hand that took in generously half the continent of Africa. "Could you find your way back to him?" "I do not know," she replied, "but he will find his way to me." "Then I have a plan," said the stranger. "I live but a few marches from here. I shall take you home, where my wife will look after you and care for you until we can find Korak or Korak finds us. If he could find you here, he can find you at my village. Is it not so?" Miriam thought that it was so, but she did not like the idea of not starting immediately back to meet Korak. On the other hand, the man had no intention of permitting this poor, insane child to wander further amidst the dangers of the jungle. From whence she had come or what she had undergone he could not guess, but that her Korak and their life among the apes was but a figment of a disordered mind he could not doubt. He knew the jungle well, and he knew that men have lived alone and naked among the savage beasts for years, but a frail and slender girl. No, it was not possible. Together they went outside. Malbin's boys were striking camp in preparation for a hasty departure. The strangers' blacks were conversing with them. Malbin stood at a distance, angry and glowering. The stranger approached one of his own men. "Find out where they got this girl," he commanded. The Negro thus addressed questioned one of Malbin's followers. Presently he returned to his master. "They bought her from old Kovudu," he said. "That is all that this fellow will tell me. He pretends that he knows nothing more, and I guess that he does not. These two white men were very bad men. They did many things that their boys knew not the meanings of. It would be well, Bwana, to kill the other." "I wish that I might, but a new law is come into this part of the jungle. It is not as it was in the old days," Muviri replied the master. The stranger remained until Malbin and his safari had disappeared into the jungle toward the north. Miriam, trustful now, stood at his side, Geeka clutched in one slim, brown hand. They talked together, the man wondering at the faltering Arabic of the girl, but attributing it finally to her defective mentality. Could he have known that years had elapsed since she had used it until she was taken by the Swedes, he would not have wondered that she had half forgotten it. There was yet another reason why the language of the sheikh had thus readily eluded her, but of that reason she herself could not have guessed the truth any better than could the man. He tried to persuade her to return with him to his village, as he called it, or Duar in Arabic, but she was insistent upon searching immediately for Korak. As a last resort, he determined to take her with him by force rather than sacrifice her life to the insane hallucination which haunted her, but, being a wise man, he determined to humor her first and then attempt to lead her as he would have her go. So when they took up their march, it was in the direction of the south, though his own ranch lay almost due east. By degrees he turned the direction of their way more and more eastward, and greatly was he pleased to note that the girl failed to discover that any change was being made. Little by little she became more trusting. At first she had but her intuition to guide her belief that this big Tarmangani meant her no harm, but as the days passed and she saw that his kindness and consideration never faltered, she came to compare him with Korak, and to be very fond of him, but never did her loyalty to her Apateman flag. On the 5th day they came suddenly upon a great plain, and from the edge of the forest the girl saw in the distance fenced fields and many buildings. At the sight she drew back in astonishment. "Where are we?" she asked, pointing. "We could not find Korak," replied the man, "and as our way led near my douar, I have brought you here to wait and rest with my wife until my men can find your ape, or he finds you. It is better thus, little one. You will be safer with us, and you will be happier." "I am afraid," Bwana said the girl. "In thy douar they will beat me as did the sheikh my father. Let me go back into the jungle. Their Korak will find me. He would not think to look for me in the douar of a white man." "No one will beat you, child," replied the man. "I have not done so, have I? Well, here all belong to me. They will treat you well. Here no one is beaten. My wife will be very good to you, and at last Korak will come, for I shall send men to search for him." The girl shook her head. They could not bring him, for he would kill them, as all men have tried to kill him. "I am afraid. Let me go, Bwana." "You do not know the way to your own country. You would be lost. The leopards or the lions would get you the first night, and after all you would not find your Korak. It is better that you stay with us. Did I not save you from the bad man? Do you not owe me something for that? Well, then remain with us for a few weeks at least until we can determine what is best for you. You are only a little girl. It would be wicked to permit you to go alone into the jungle." Miriam laughed. "The jungle," she said, "is my father and my mother. It has been kinder to me than have men. I am not afraid of the jungle, nor am I afraid of the leopard or the lion. When my time comes I shall die. It may be that a leopard or a lion shall kill me. Or it may be a tiny bug no bigger than the end of my littlest finger. When the lion leaps upon me, or the little bug stings me, I shall be afraid. Oh, then I shall be terribly afraid, I know, but life would be very miserable indeed were I to spend it in terror of the thing that has not yet happened. If it be the lion, my terror shall be short of life, but if it be the little bug, I may suffer for days before I die, and so I fear the lion least of all. He is great and noisy. I can hear him or see him, or smell him in time to escape, but any moment I may place a hand or foot on the little bug, and never know that he is there until I feel his deadly sting. No, I do not fear the jungle. I love it. I should rather die than leave it forever, but your douar is close beside the jungle. You have been good to me. I will do as you wish, and remain here for a while to wait the coming of my Korak. Good, said the man, and he led the way down toward the flower-covered bungalow behind which lay the barns and outhouses of a well-ordered African farm. As they came nearer, a dozen dogs ran barking toward them, gaunt wolfhounds, a huge Great Dane, a nimble-footed collie, and a number of yapping, quarrelsome fox terriers. At first their appearance was savage and unfriendly in the extreme, but once they recognized the foremost black warriors and the white man behind them, their attitude underwent a remarkable change. The collie and the fox terriers became frantic with delirious joy, and while the wolfhounds and the Great Dane were not a whit less delighted at the return of their master, their greetings were of a more dignified nature. Each in turn sniffed at Miriam, who displayed not the slightest fear of any of them. The wolfhounds bristled and growled at the scent of wild beasts that clung to her garment, but when she laid her hand upon their heads and her soft voice murmured caressingly, they half closed their eyes, lifting their upper lips in contented canine smiles. The man was watching them, and he too smiled, for it was seldom that these savage brutes took thus kindly to strangers. It was as though in some subtle way the girl had breathed a message of kindred savagery to their savage hearts. With her slim fingers grasping the collar of a wolfhound upon either side of her, Miriam walked on toward the bungalow, upon the porch of which a woman dressed in white waved a welcome to her returning lord. There was more fear in the girl's eyes now than there had been in the presence of strange men or savage beasts. She hesitated, turning an appealing glance toward the man. "This is my wife," he said. "She will be glad to welcome you." The woman came down the path to meet them. The man kissed her, and turning toward Miriam introduced them, speaking in the Arab tongue the girl understood. "This is Miriam, my dear," he said, and he told the story of the jungle waif insofar as he knew it. Miriam saw that the woman was beautiful. She saw that sweetness and goodness were stamped indelibly upon her countenance. She no longer feared her, and when her brief story had been narrated and the woman came and put her arms about her and kissed her and called her poor little darling, something snapped in Miriam's little heart. She buried her face on the bosom of this new friend, in whose voice was the mother tone that Miriam had not heard for so many years that she had forgotten its very existence. She buried her face on the kindly bosom and wept as she had not wept before in all her life, tears of relief and joy that she could not fathom. And so came Miriam, the savage little Mangani, out of her beloved jungle into the midst of a home of culture and refinement. Already Bwana and my dear, she first heard them called and continued to call them, were as father and mother to her. Once her savage fears allayed, she went to the opposite extreme of trustfulness and love. Now she was willing to wait here until they found Korak, or Korak found her. She did not give up that thought. Korak always was first.